Sorry,
It's
can I
better than
ambush
it
you
was.
with some more plats?
I would love that.
I can see that.
Someone nicknamed it the Jeffersonian.
It's two different
Soul
ones, so
Barrel.
there's 4 total. So.
Thank you.
you're
As
the
if that's a
chair.
bad thing.
Let's see. Looks like everyone's here. Green.
Korea's the closest one to this place.
Yeah.
Didn't give me excuse.
This one's on page 2.
He doesn't have a charlottesville.gov email address that we all don't have, right?
He does not have the same thing we do not have, yes.
Yes, okay, cool. What? Someone sent an email to like 5 of us, and the one that was addressed to him was khabab@charlottesville.gov, and I'm like, I'm pretty sure that doesn't exist.
Yeah.
It's good to know.
Did we get more emails in the last 30 minutes?
We did. I think Liz, just as I was walking out the door.
Apologies. Hello, everyone. Two new things. 5:02. No one stepped somewhere is very angry at me. I believe we are ready to begin. Is it true?
Yeah, so as we were noting, one planning commissioner,
Yeah, he's right there.
and there he is. And it was our understanding that Councilor Payne would be joining us, but not yet present, but that's probably okay.
I'm sure he will get here as soon as he can. Let's see. Do I have a bit to start us off? Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming. I think I got a letter from you.
Sorry?
I got a letter from you, Mr. Freeze. Are you starting us off?
Yes,
Yes.
yes,
Please do so.
the letter, I don't remember. Memo, got it. All right, good evening, everybody. So first off, I note we are trying out a new room setup. We thought we'd tried this just to be more of a conversational environment. Staff here at the table, you guys facing each other, see how it works in terms of work sessions. So let us know your feelings after the meeting. So this evening we have 3 items. We're aiming for 1 hour apiece: critical slopes, floodplain ordinance, and entrance corridor design review. For the first 2 items, I'm sorry, for the first and the last item, critical slopes and ERB, these are, this is our second time discussing these items within the context of the zoning rewrite. We also spoke about these back at the beginning of August, and based on the feedback of those meetings and what we've heard from general public, staff discussions, we're bringing back, some additional thoughts for your, feedback and guidance as we prepare drafting of the next module, the development standards module, where these things will come into play. So we're not aiming to make any decisions on these items tonight. We're really, again, looking for you guys' feedback. And I'd refer you to the 3 questions I posed at the end of the memo, in particular, that question around, is there additional data or information that we can provide that will help as we move into assessing actual draft ordinance language later on? Just in terms of updates and process, we are still anticipating release of Module 1 by the end of next week. So that, again, is the zoning districts, the zoning map, the land use table, those items. And at that point, I'm just going to pause. Any process questions before we go into the meat of the agenda?
So the deliverable for tonight is just a conversation. You don't want any, there's nothing, you're not asking for.
Not asking.
A firm direction, just chat about these things.
I'm looking, yeah, chat, though if we reach the point where there is firm direction, I'd be happy to accept it.
So is there a future work session scheduled on these specific issues to make those decisions?
So the next thing you guys will see will be actual draft ordinance language, which we will be discussing at your work session at the end of March. Am I getting that date right? Module 2 is end of March, right? And so that's when, yes.
So staff will be making their recommendations in the draft language, and that's all, okay,
You got it.
gotcha.
So that's where we are in the process. So, and what I didn't notice, so floodplain is not something we've talked about in the context of zoning rewrite in the past. It's an issue of interest both on the commission and in the public, and something that staff has been looking at in the context of some other planning work. So we're bringing that forward for you guys as well tonight. So that's everything I got for context. Good? All right, so I'm gonna dive into critical slopes. I hope everyone had a chance to read the memo. So I'm generally not gonna repeat what's in the memo, I'm just gonna kind of build off of there. But generally, as you guys are very familiar, the critical slope ordinance prevents disturbance of certain steeply sloped areas, except by a waiver that is granted by city council, often accompanied by a set of conditions. The initial proposal from the zoning reproach report that was issued back in June suggested that we were gonna roll the critical slopes provisions into our general water protection ordinances, and make them more of an administrative review with a set of associated standards. But based on feedback we got from y'all in August and what we've heard otherwise, we kind of started revisiting, we had some discussions among staff and are proposing to revisit that approach. As we've dug into these questions, looked at what analysis might be necessary to look at this issue, and assess the level of potential interest and therefore the amount of community engagement that would be necessary to move forward with this stuff, we're proposing at this point a two-phase approach where we would tweak the existing critical slope program, but largely leave it intact as it exists today, and then look ahead to a larger, more comprehensive look at our environmental regulations in a kind of a separate project following the zoning rewrite. So in terms of tweaking it, we'd be looking at retaining it, but also simplifying and clarifying what's there today. And then for the long term, looking at something that might likely include the concept of looking at expanding our stream buffer program from what it is today. And for those who aren't familiar, our stream buffer today actually encompasses, I believe, 3 buffers along 3 streams.
Three
Three.
streams.
Three. Yeah. Yeah.
Meadow, Moores, Riviera.
Yeah, everyone can catch those. All right. So when I look back at the ordinance, in the memo that I wrote, I identified 5 general issues that we've identified with the critical slopes ordinance. I think number 1 and 5 are pretty self-explanatory as written, but I'm happy to dive into those as you like. One of them is clarifying the review process, which is presented, as it presents in the ordinance, kind of looks like 3 related but kind of distinct review processes, but we know it's
Do
one.
you want us to wait till you get through, or do you want us to stop as questions pop up?
How are you guys comfortable? How do you want to do it?
Whatever's good for you. For me,
I'm content to let you finish.
Why don't I just run through this? I'm not intending to talk for a long time. I want to get into discussion. So, so the 5th item is just clarifying some discrepancies between the subdivision ordinance and zoning ordinance with regard to critical slopes. But the real meat of it is in what I identified in that list as items 2, 3, and 4. So I'm going to talk about those in a little more detail. So the first thing to understand when we look at the critical slopes ordinance is that the question that's being asked, the question of whether the land area on a given lot that is steeply sloped, that is defined as a critical slope, whether that's available for development, right? That's an early threshold question that a developer needs to answer kind of at the beginning of their project as they understand what can they do with a given piece of property. Then as one moves through the design and permitting process, they dig in deeper into the technical review, a lot of the things that we think of as coming up as part of the site plan review, stormwater questions and stuff like that. So one of the challenges that we perceive within the critical slope ordinance is that it kind of straddles both of those worlds, right? It's an initial threshold question. In the opinion and the discretionary review of the planning commission and city council, is this portion of this lot available for development? Should my design incorporate it? But the answer to that question may be dependent on more technical questions, criteria that would come up later in my design process. So that's kind of the first issue. Then what comes right off of that then is the decision to grant the waiver, right? As it's built into the zoning ordinance today, that is either a finding 1 or a finding 2. So if you remember, finding 2 is the one that basically looks at the question of there's essentially no choice but to use the critical slope area, because otherwise there isn't a building site available on the
Undue
property.
hardship.
Effectively a hardship standard, exactly right. Finding number one is the one where we're asking a balancing question, right? Is this, does some form of public benefit of developing that site outweigh the inherent public benefit of the critical slope as it exists in its undisturbed state? So in practice, my observation, and I think those others of staff have been involved, is that oftentimes we've taken into account the broader public benefits of a proposed project, right? The provision of a fire station or affordable housing and the like. In reading the ordinance, though, the ordinance, while not perfectly clear on this point, seems to be pointing us in the direction of that we really should be comparing the environmental benefits of the proposed project against the environmental benefits of the slope as it exists today. And so one of the areas really we need clarity on is which of those two are we aiming at? Now, when I look at it, honestly, there's also the potential of there being a little bit of both, right? So we come back to the question of where in the process this is occurring. It's occurring at the beginning. We can look at this from the perspective of saying the proposed benefit of this, whatever it is, the proposed use outweighs, but what we want to do at that point is look at in comparison to the specific environmental benefits of the specific slope in question, right? Understanding that not all critical slopes are created equal, and that's where the value of a discretionary review potentially comes into play, right? Is this a intact forested slope stretching down to the Ravenna River, or is it a man-made slope in the middle of a site with, parking and a otherwise disturbed site on either side of it, right? So, I guess what I'm suggesting is when we look at weighing it in that way, might be an answer that kind of splits that difference, particularly if we then also have a standard set of requirements that could be attached to a critical slope related to those technical items that I talked about that come later in the design process. Things like stormwater or erosion and sediment control, which are two of the key attributes of why we're protecting critical slopes in the first place, right?
Can I ask a really high level question? Or I can wait for you to finish.
I am basically at the end.
We'll
So go right ahead.
Sure. It's sort of on that point.
Yeah.
What is special about a critical slope of 25% or more that is different from an area near a stream that is not as sloped, like 20% grade? Is it, I guess like I can see how erosion control would be more difficult, but there are requirements for that in either case. But we're saying that, at least the current ordinance says, if you have a 20% slope right next to a stream, on both sides of a stream, you can pave that entire thing, buy nutrient credits downstream, and we're not going to do anything to stop you. But if it's 25%, that's not allowed, because these are special areas.
Do you want to?
Sure. So, depending on what guidance material you look at when it comes to responsible site design, there's always, you should avoid steep slopes because of the added threat of sediment control if it's not properly done. I can't tell you the difference. You just identified it. It's 5%, one's 20%, one's 25%. To me, what's always confused me is I don't have a city code in front of me, but it says something along those outweigh the environmental benefits of this critical slope. We don't have like cliff dwelling bats or anything like that live in critical slopes. So I've never understood implicitly what that was, which is probably why a lot of our conversations we've had many times go towards construction, which goes to the next order of operations. So very generally, very generally, it's more valuable to have forest along the river at 19% than it is to have an arbitrary hill somewhere else that's not near the river at 27%. Very generally.
Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, as far as where that line is drawn, you have to draw the line somewhere. But we know that, I don't want to repeat what Jack's just said, but it's the velocity of water running down a slope that has a higher potential for erosion, which can have a greater possibility of damaging the quality of the water downstream.
So we're really thinking about the danger of disturbing the slope and not any inherent public benefit of the slope existing statically.
I think that's where maybe the two things crossed, because when, in the practical aspect of it, when we come before you with these things, is protecting the slope from erosion control standpoint. But the what describes the critical slopes that we're talking about is it's gotta be within 200 feet of a water body, greater than 25% and contiguous. So if it's contiguous, you can have critical slopes that's 1,200 feet from the water body, as long as that stretches down to the water body. So we're not, again, I think the code is written to protect the environmental sensitive areas that are closer to water, and then it weirdly grabs in the slopes, which pulls that farther away from the proximity issue of sensitive areas.
Yeah. And that's not to say that there's an ancillary benefit to protecting critical slopes that arrives from, that when you protect those slopes, you're also picking up trees, habitat area, and those types of things. No question that that ancillary benefit exists.
Well, but it doesn't exist anymore on slopes and on flat places. It's just that we've protected slopes historically, so that's where they are now.
Right, and so that's part of the reason when we were discussing what's the next step, and this idea of a more comprehensive look at our environmental regulations, particularly those in relation to water quality in our streams and rivers. We think a buffer ordinance, a buffer ordinance explicitly would be protecting habitat value along the waterway, regardless of the slope of that land.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not to replace critical slopes, but it would be an additional and more effective towards achieving that goal.
Okay.
To that end, about your 25%, depending on what documents you look at, 15's thrown out there, 20, 25, these are advisory slopes. 25 is about the least steep you get before people have concerns with it. And similarly, a lot of places that have, and this is not in Virginia, this is general practice, that have stream buffer protections, they're usually extended if they're adjacent to slope. And so that's how you capture it, because that does link the two together. You're having erosion into a sensitive area. But, so I think we being, when this was created, whenever it was, we're aiming in the right place and maybe missed a little bit in that regard.
Have you said your bits? Let's go around, just get where people are on this. Mr. Mitchell, can we start with you, please?
If you would let me digress just a little bit. The last couple of critical slope reviews we didn't have the usual technical guidance in them, so we had to make the decision based on our fire station, for example. We had to make a decision based on our belief that the need to disturb that critical slope was outweighed by the public need to have a new fire station in place. And I forget what the other one was, but there was another one like that, and we had to make the decision without the benefit of the guidance from the engineers and the benefit of the mitigation, these critical slope disturbance mitigation advice that we get from the typical staff report. At what point is Jack going to, or the engineers or NDS, at what point are we going to get a chance to go back and address the environmental issues for the fire station and for the other one that we approved that was like that?
So I'm gonna push back a little bit and say that the technical advice was absolutely incorporated into those projects, because Jack consults with our planner in the development of the conditions that were recommended for all of those projects.
It was not clearly specified. The mitigation suggestions that are typically in the staff report were not in the fire report, and it was not in the one prior to that. There were, and I'm talking about the kinds of things that Jack and the engineers typically suggest we do to protect against drainage and to protect against erosion and things like that. That wasn't there. Maybe it was implicit, but it wasn't as detailed as it has been in other slopes. And it may be a result of, engineering has always felt that the critical slope waiver came a little too early in the game for him to give us detailed input. And that's,
Actually the point, I was maybe not making as clearly as possible, that around that decision of, the land use decision versus the technical analysis, right? The work that Jack does in terms of looking at the proposed stormwater mitigation, erosion control, is all stuff that happens during the site plan review process today, right, which is later in the process.
understood.
But
That's
this
the point Jack
critical
has
slope
made over
question-
and over again.
The critical slope question is a threshold question that needs to be decided at the beginning of a process.
So if we, again, the fire station is gonna happen, but
Yep.
yes, use that as an example. If we approve that, but once we get to the site plan, stuff, and there are things that engineering feel are just absolutely gonna like flood the stream with debris, or more trees than we expected are gonna be taken out, you guys have the ability to put the brakes on the project.
Yeah, I might let you answer that specifically.
Sure,
So
that-
the stormwater ordinance, the erosion sediment control ordinance, which cover those issues generally, whether there's critical slopes present or not, will be part of that review process.
Yes, this is all very complicated, but if you were to submit a preliminary plan requesting this, regardless of whether you all approve it or not, well, you'd have to approve it to get to us, and they submit a final plan, we, whether it's in critical slopes or not, apply state regulations to that plan. And so it was confusing for me under the old method, was a lot of times we present you with this, I mean, it's a waiver process, right? The idea is that you're not supposed to be able to build on this, it's restricted. So if you're doing a waiver, it felt to me as a lot of times we're providing waivers because I was providing assurances that we were gonna do these things. That's complicated, because we do that for every project, right? So why have this extra thing if, you know, I could tell you the developers think we're doing a good job by the rate that they complain about all of our inspections and everything else. So that's, the question becomes, it's sort of a process issue, because we don't have the authority. Our authority to enforce erosion sediment control and stormwater regulation comes from the state. And so if we go beyond that, we're supposed to have approval from the State Water Control Board to enforce those things. So it got to be concerning to me to come in here and provide requirements above and beyond that outside of that process. I don't know that you can call somebody and say, oh, that's not in accordance. It's a gray area. It's project by project. But that's where it comes, and for me, I was kind of reading the code. It was, what the public benefit part is what confused me, because I'd come here and you guys would say, is this gonna protect sediment? And I'd say what I always say, we always try and protect sediment and resources. And then it gets approved because I said we're gonna do a good job, and then it's confusing, what is the public benefit we're providing, right? Because it sounds like environmental public benefits is what the focus is. That's my expertise. I have, as I've said before, I don't have a metric to say 3 affordable units or 1 fire station is equivalent to some public benefit, environmental benefit. And so I think that a little bit got lost in translation, which is why we shifted, because of NDS needed to get a little more involved in weighing that public benefit. And here we are still deciding which is the question for you is, and maybe you're not the appropriate people because it's already in city code, but the question is, what are we supposed to be doing? What is the public benefit that we're addressing? To clarify this process, because what I'd rather do is tell them, here's our concerns, here's a condition or two, of course, we're gonna apply that in the future, and then they can roll that into what we determine is the public benefit they're weighing that against. So they could say, yes, it could be done responsibly, the engineers think it could be done responsibly, at whatever stage in the process we decide this goes to, and then whomever, y'all, city council can then weigh the greater public benefit, if that's in fact what we're doing. Does that make sense?
So, I'll try to work with it.
Okay.
The fire station would not have been approved had it not been for the greater public benefit. Not for the greater environmental public benefit, but the greater overall public benefit. So as we're trying to understand public benefit, I think we need to remember that South Brook Street would not have been approved had we not believed that that was for the greater public benefit. Not the environmental public benefit, with all the mitigation stuff, but because we needed more affordable housing, we needed to help CHRA get that built and get the light tip credits in, and we needed a new fire station so that we can get larger apparatuses in and out of it, so. I probably stated the obvious, but what the heck?
And to be clear on the fire station, and this is the other confusing thing that really goes more to the applicants. They always say it says, we have an application that says, address if you want to do finding one or finding two. They always fill out both, which is weird because it's got to be one or the other. Maybe it can be both. They always fill out both. And then there's the 6 conditions which aren't aimed at either one. For the fire station, they said finding two. If you remember the critical slope sort of circled the fire station, I looked at it and said, you can't do anything with this parcel without disturbing some of that. And so I recommended to, I believe, Dan or whoever the planner was, I concur with the applicant's findings under finding two, which I'd never done before because nobody had clearly ever identified this as under finding two. And we never had one that actually you couldn't access the property without disturbing steep slopes. So that one made sense to me.
I want to not monopolize this, but I want to ask one more
Please.
question, and then I think I should just let other people go. Finding two, do we really need it? Because finding one really helped. Finding two, pretty much, unless we're looking at a takings issue, why does finding two even exist? Because I think we should go back to the public benefit question, because that, at the end of the day, granting a waiver like that should always be in the public benefit, and not because a developer can't do something with the property without disturbing the critical slope and taking out a lot of trees and disturbing the streams. So why not do away with finding two?
I think finding two is purely looking at the takings issue.
Okay. Okay, I'm sorry, guys.
Mr. Duranzia, please.
So, I'm gonna open with a piggyback on Mr. Mitchell's question about, public good. And it occurs to me that, we are, the context of the ordinance seems to, they say not limited to, and then all sorts of basically environmental. Giving the very strong impression that we're talking about the more environmental. If we adjust this ordinance for a broader reading of the public good, whatever that means, are we not, how do we go about quantifying that and qualifying it and finding the quality of it? Because it seems to me that without something fairly robust, what we're essentially inviting developers to do is get an entire bus of trial lawyers to come roaring right down the middle of the downtown mall on this issue, right? Because if we start saying no critical waiver for X, and we have some sort of fuzzy about what the public good is, have we given thought? Is there thought on how do you quantify this? Do we need to have a priori scoring system in place that we can point to and defend? What if that doesn't work and we all look at it and says, well, that doesn't work, we're not gonna do it anyway? I mean, it seems that if we broaden this, and I'm not saying that we should or shouldn't, I think we should, but how do we balance that? And how do we define the public good piece?
So I'm gonna start by saying that's a good
Oh,
question.
okay.
That's a good question, right? But I'm also gonna say, hey, that's part of a discretionary review process to begin with, right? I mean, if we could quantify it exactly, then we could just put it straight in the ordinance and leave aside the need for a waiver.
Or
So,
planning commissioners.
right, so it comes with the task, but it's not a free-for-all.
Right.
What you got, all of your decisions are based fundamentally on the comprehensive plan, or in some, actually, that's what you guys are looking to. That's where your guidance comes from.
So do we memorialize that in the ordinance very deliberately in considering a waiver, and we rewrite that from soup to nuts? Here are things to consider?
Potentially. But I'm just gonna,
If then, or if this condition then.
I don't know, I wouldn't wanna get into if-then statements, because every site is gonna be different. And I think what we have to remember is what the ordinance is asking you to do is a comparative decision, right? I think what we haven't done as much of to date is really assessing what is the value of the particular critical slope that is in play in this particular project. Are we looking at an intact, undisturbed slope along a
Yeah.
waterway, or are we looking at a man-made, weedy slope adjacent to a parking lot?
Well,
Would-
and I guess my question to that is, and you've alluded to this in your introductory remarks, is that making differentiations in these is also adds to that. But, and I certainly wouldn't be looking for a rigid metric, but just sort of some sort of guidance as to, okay, this is and not for sort of a general case, every site's different, but we have a situation where, well, this critical slope is awful, but we're building 600 affordable units on it. But it's awful. Now what do we do?
What do you mean it's awful?
Well, I mean, the consequences of granting this waiver have secondary impacts, aesthetic, environmental, otherwise. But that the planning commission and then council decides, you know what? You know, we're making an omelet here, there are gonna be broken eggs, and that's the way it's gonna be. But if we do that, and we flip it on its head and don't do that in another circumstance that's substantially similar, again, are we opening ourselves up to?
This is the precedent question, right? To what degree does each decision establish precedent
And we defend ourselves by hiding behind the ordinance language if we need to.
But you also you also have the comprehensive plan to hide behind and say, you know, we identified very clearly in this comprehensive plan that affordable housing is a major priority. If this project were, say, just meeting the bare minimum of our inclusionary zoning ordinance, you could very easily make the argument, this is a high-quality environment, it's not outweighed by a effectively standard development project in this location. You know, one of the things also to be careful of is nothing about what we're talking about changes the fact that we can't attach a condition to a project that mandates additional affordable housing
Yeah.
under critical slopes. There's no rational nexus between intrusion into an intact critical slope and the provision of affordable housing. So we wouldn't still be able to condition a project to say, oh, this one outweighs it if you put more affordable housing in it. Because we don't have a handle to do
Yeah,
that.
Then you get into the negotiation.
Right,
And
and-
you can't really do that. But
Right.
back to Mr. Mitchell's point, all right, I mean, not to argue with my example, boy, we got to have a firehouse here. We've got to do X to this critical slope. That's awful.
And there's also, part of your decision is also gonna relate to what is the degree of mitigation being offered. And I don't necessarily even mean what we're talking about in terms of the stormwater erosion and sediment control stuff, which I think we're gonna try and standardize as a set of conditions. But, and this is something that's suggested by the existing ordinance. Well, we could see this fire station outweighing, or this affordable housing project outweighing the value of the site if this area in particular is preserved, because this is the most critical of the critical slope. Or if the intrusion is limited to this degree, or if some other action is taken. I can't speculate on all the different
Yeah,
permutations
yeah,
of what
yeah.
that could look like.
I guess I'm just sort of stumbling around trying to figure out if we're going to explicitly broaden this in the ordinance to include public good, you know, capital P, capital G. How are, you know, what are the balancers in there, and how do we memorialize any of it so that we're not in a free-for-all situation, or doing something that, you know, in hindsight turns out to be incredibly dumb.
Well, and then frankly, the other option here is that you don't have a waiver, with the exception of a finding two scenario.
Yeah, yeah.
And you just simply say,
Sorry.
critical slopes, no matter their characteristics of that particular critical slope, they're sacrosanct, and you draw the line, right?
But I think what you're describing is kind of the position we're in right now, because
Yeah, I'm trying to fix it.
I don't, I don't know if, I'm still not clear if should have been, not me, if the group should have been evaluating public benefits beyond environmental or not. I don't know who's supposed to make that determination. I'm not a lawyer.
Yeah.
But I think That's why we're here, is to figure that out.
Yeah, and what that, and I'm just sort of curious as to what a first swing at that would look like.
Right.
And how, what sort of balancing language is in the ordinance,
But I will say, we're taking the feedback and the comment, and we'll continue that thought and say, what are there additional things that we can do to shape that conversation on what is a public benefit in the weighing that needs to be done for this waiver.
Very good.
fine.
Mr. Buck, please.
Thank you. I think, yeah, until we can include that language under capital P, public good, that's why it's good that it's discretionary. So thanks for keeping that way. I had a question on looking at the environmental benefits from preserving the critical slopes. We don't just look at water. We're using that to look at tree canopy, habitat loss, all that kind of stuff. Are there any avenues that exist outside of the critical slope to preserve those assets?
That's honestly, that's the issue we want to look at on a more long-term basis. So because from our perspective, there's nothing, the habitat on a slope of greater than 25 degrees is not inherently more valuable than on a slope of less than 25 degrees. We have a strong interest in preserving trees and habitat, particularly along our stream corridors, because there's incredible value there to preserving habitat and trees along those corridors. So we think that we should be exploring a more robust buffer type program that would need to recognize and have built into it a differentiation between existing natural buffer areas versus already developed sites. And we would need to treat those within the ordinance differently. But what we quickly came to the conclusion as we started this conversation, and we started talking about the mapping we would do, the analysis we would do, and the level of community interest on this topic, and therefore the level of community engagement we would need to do, that this is outside of the scope of what we can accomplish within this zoning rewrite that we are aiming to complete in a timely manner. So it necessarily would be a project that we would pick up at a future date. But I think there was broadly a recognition that there was value in having that, doing that project and engaging in that community conversation around what we could do with that type of ordinance.
Yeah, that to me seems like if we're pulling apart we're using the critical slopes ordinance for.
In some respects,
really.
it kind of feels like we're using the critical slopes as a stand-in for a buffer.
In some cases.
Yeah.
I know we have used it in some projects. I can't remember the name of it, but there was this part of stream restoration to be included where we kind of left the site off. You leave it better than the way it is now.
1613 Grove.
Oh, yeah, 1613 Grove. But I guess would we, as a rule of thumb, you mentioned 25%, could we change the percentage of critical slopes to 15 if we wanted to? Just throwing that question out there with a follow-up of, to make it clearer for developers, would we then throw in all of Jack's conditions that we always include as just a base minimum?
I'm hesitant to put it in the ordinance because of the issue that Jack referenced with the state water control board. So right now, as kind of an interim measure, we're looking at being a standard set of conditions that we would share, we would aim for people to be aware of, but not put them in the ordinance. And I know that feels a little bit like whatever, smoke and mirrors, but.
And I guess my last question is about getting into the man-made slopes and the natural slopes. And how do they are different, and some have more value than others, but I don't know if I'm qualified to say, are there any benefits to man-made slopes that will affect our, if assuming site plan reviews, as a rule of thumb, you generally have to meet all the guidelines and leave it, a lot of the times if they're not performing well and there's erosion, you have to leave it better than it was found.
So my answer is that that's something that falls on staff. We need to, in our process of consulting with our colleagues in other departments, be able to provide you some guidance on in terms of what the quality is of that existing slope environment, man-made or natural, what have you. I don't know, Jack, if you have anything on the particular value of man-made slopes?
No, the term natural slope is a little confusing, because if you were to go look at the Rivanna, those aren't quite man-made, but if you were to go back there 1,000 years ago and look at the Rivanna, it probably wouldn't look like that either. So, but man-made slopes are less relevant because they probably were made in the last 100 years, which means they probably don't have a 100-year oak tree growing on them, right? Or another part of the functioning environment, like along the Rivanna or along one of our stream channels. That being said, the way that we use this to capture other environmental issues like trees and things, which might be growing on those slopes that have been undeveloped for 70 years because they're slopes next to a road, it closes the door on our ability to use this for other things, as you are alluding to. But generally, man-made slopes are not as important as natural slopes, keeping in mind that a slope itself is not a great natural treasure. It's what's on the slope. That's the value.
I guess, it seems to me, until we have the buffer ordinance in place and we have these enhancements that we can add to the natural resources, or, the other avenues that we can add to enhance and preserve natural resources, we want to look at ways to, you're asking us, how do we beef up, or I guess, I don't know if staff had recommendations on beefing up and clarifying critical slopes. We don't want to go in the other direction by taking out man-made slopes, for example, until we
Right.
have something better in place to protect the trees that are there.
I think what we're proposing is essentially status quo with just bringing more clarity to the existing ordinance, and then what we bring into the staff reports and administration of preparing you guys to make that decision, or preparing council to make that decision, or for you guys to advise council.
Thanks.
Ms. Russell?
I guess maybe I just want to start with maybe like a very broad question, because it sounds like what Mr. Dawson is saying is if a critical slope waiver is granted to an applicant, he and his team through site plan review are going to ensure that that project meet all stormwater requirements, right? So is there ever a point in which a slope, in that, a threshold in which that just can't be mitigated, like it's a cliff and there's nothing you could do? Put another way, there's always some measure that can be done to address stormwater. And so, what are we trying to do if it can always be remedied? Are we putting a check on the number, the frequency, and I think there's other things, there's corollary benefits to steep slopes, but that's putting that aside for right now. What is the fundamental, just from an engineering standpoint, of the critical slopes ordinance?
No, so, from an engineering standpoint, from city engineering standpoint, not much, because we do those reviews regardless. And to your point, if a developer sees a yield to be made on a piece of property, they can figure out how to do it, regardless of what's going on there. And that sometimes we go back and forth about the best methods, or this is unlikely to work, or, you don't have enough room here, or whatever it is, especially when they start trying to avoid critical slopes, and they sort of box themselves in sometimes when they start designing how they're gonna get access down there, or build this access road, or build the pond, or whatever it is. But that's kind of the problem, is that we do these for all these sites. And you can protect any site, and there's not another check or another, we do the conditions, which.
Can I, a couple points on this. One, actually, I think, just correct me if I'm wrong, anybody, but the critical slope ordinance was adopted before we had moved into the state stormwater program?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, so that's part of your answer right there. But
That's a good point.
the other thing, just exactly as Jack was
Because
saying.
that rolls it into this newer.
Well, it just suggests that when we adopted the critical slopes ordinance, it was in the absence
We didn't have
of
that,
the
right.
program that Jack is talking about, right? But that's not a reason to necessarily can it. In some respects, what we're saying by having it is that as a matter of policy, the city prefers the natural stormwater management or erosion control benefits of a natural slope over a engineered solution. Right, that's
We don't specifically say that, but we imply that.
by having that ordinance, by saying this is,
Yeah.
that these slopes cannot be disturbed. We're effectively saying, yes, well, you could engineer that.
Sure.
And the steeper the slope and the less space, the more expensive that solution is, but the fact of the matter is anyone, with the money, the resources could do it, but we're saying that, leaving that aside, the preference of the city, the policy preference of the city would be that stormwater and erosion along our waterways on steep slopes is addressed via a natural method as opposed to an engineered
Sure,
solution.
we don't wanna continue to underground streams and things like that, or move away from that. But maybe that should be more like.
Explicit.
Explicit, because it sounds like we're using, I think you said critical slopes as a stand-in for something, but it's like, it's a stand-in seemingly for tree protection, for habitat, for big retaining walls that are, inhumane. And relying on a purely environment, like we're using the wrong metric to evaluate it. If we're saying, well, it could be, the stormwater could be addressed. So I don't know, I don't have any solutions. Those are my thoughts, right now.
Thank you. Mr. Schwartz, please.
I don't know what to add. I mean, it's, I think we kind of talked ourselves into a little bit of a box. I mean, ideally, to me, it seems like the critical slope process doesn't need to exist. Like, we need to have a buffer ordinance. We need to have a tree protection ordinance that, does a better job. We need to, if habitat's important, we need to have something for that. And the slopes are just arbitrary, but I guess since that's our only tool, I don't know what to tell you. I do feel like we probably need to, our review needs to focus on environmental issues as opposed to, development or affordable housing and things like that, although the temptation, my temptation would also be to say, well, okay, this person's gonna bring in a whole bunch of affordable housing, let them put it wherever, but no, I think we need to clean it up, and it does need to be environmentally focused in our review, at least while we still have this ordinance in place. And hopefully someday you can get the buffer ordinance figured out, and we can use that instead.
Want to do anything with that?
I took it as a comment. I'm actually curious if there's any response around the table.
Oh, I don't know if it was because of what you said or just because I thought of it, but there's a link between, maybe James, what you said about we prefer a natural approach to stormwater management. We also then are sort of talking about the character of Charlottesville. Charlottesville is hilly. It has steep slopes. Unless Roy can flatten out the whole thing, it's going to continue. But
And
that-
plant 100-year-old trees on top.
That's amusing.
Mr. Stolzenberg, I heard your name.
What I think is we need to put the retractable bollards back in the CIP to stop Phil's bus full of lawyers from driving down the mall. Can't have
They're not
that.
my lawyers.
To Carl's point, I think that is way too absolute. I think to say that we can't redevelop South Street and, everyone there has to stay in their kind of, obsolete and like should be improved homes because it's near a slope, and to come up with some engineering solution that completely mitigates the benefit might cost hundreds of thousands. I don't know that it did, but if you're in a situation like that or worse, to say that, we just have to freeze the status quo regardless of the non-environmental public benefit seems extreme. It does seem to me that there are two very different classes of reasons we've granted these things, right? Like with South First Street, there may have been real impacts on that stream, but there was a very clear public benefit. With 1613 Grove, I think, even Jack agreed that the post condition would be better for the environment. It seems to me that maybe there's a way where you get a waiver on environmental grounds, that there's an environmental benefit that outweighs the risks or damage from the disturbance. And that could probably be a staff waiver, because you guys are more qualified to determine that than us. And then maybe you come to this discretionary process to weigh those more, nebulous or, touchy-feely public benefits of like shribbling hundreds of new homes, some amount of affordable homes. Is that worth it for the city versus these slopes? I can see that being being more of a discretionary process for council. And then, 1613 Grove, I think, was an easy one because the stream's in bad condition, whatever. It seems to me the one thing beyond just the general ESC requirements that Jack would be imposing otherwise is on-site water treatment. And that's kind of what we got with Azalea, where they could have done it and not had on-site water treatment, and they said, we're going to do 110% of the water, or also Belmont condos, or whatever they call it nowadays, where, we want that, right?
And those are good examples of where it was easier, at least for me to say, there's some public benefit here, because
Mhm.
was mentioning this earlier when we were talking about these buffers, but we, in theory, something we could go to the Water Control Board with and change our code. Right now, if you build in Charlottesville, as in the whole state, except maybe the Chesapeake Bay area, and other locality and positions, if you go to Emerald County, go to Greene County, anywhere,
Mhm.
you are allowed to buy nutrient credits,
Mhm.
right? And that's not great for the city. The water quality is a much bigger problem than a local problem. What we generate here goes downstream.
Yeah,
what comes-
it's fine
et
for the
cetera, et
bay,
cetera.
but we still don't get any benefit.
Yeah, and so it's troubling here. We still have creeks here in an urban area. It'd be nice if we treated some water here than just said, these are urban streams. We're gonna forsake these poor things and we'll plant trees out where there's already trees, or something,
Mhm.
put an easement around a forest. And it's possible to say, we'd have to go for the Water Control Board. If you develop in these areas, whether it's critical slopes, you disturb a critical slopes, you have to do X. Treat 120%. I was comfortable giving those recommendations because in both those instances, the developer said, we're gonna do this.
Mhm.
And all I did was try and turn that into language where it comes back, both me and the engineer who submitted the plans know exactly what it means. There's not a discrepancy about, I thought it was pre-20% loading, whatever it is. We just smooth out that language. It would be possible to roll that into a more comprehensive program. If you're disturbing steep slopes and you don't have a public benefit outweighing it, you must do X. That would in theory be possible.
But we'd have to get the state approval.
We'd have to get the state to approve it.
Yeah, so I guess my hope was that by saying you could still go through this critical slope process like we have now, and you don't have that ability to get that automatic approval, and then kind of giving you this other avenue where if you do have these clear environmental benefit, that you can skip that whole thing. If we could word the ordinance clearly enough that we can tell ourselves.
I also
future
wonder, and
us.
this is something that we haven't really talked about and we need to look into, but can we, if it's a condition, can we take a more of a stance that on-site water treatment is one of the standard conditions, and we're not changing the ordinance to reflect that, and therefore maybe don't need state water control board approval, but we have it as a standard condition that we're going to mandate on steep slopes until we adopt our new program, when we would seek water control board approval and codify it, but in the meantime, that we'd do it as effectively a standard condition that we would.
Yeah, I guess, see, that's where I'm seeing a problem, right? Like, I'm saying
I get
if
the
you
problem.
have that, and there's an environmental benefit, there shouldn't be any more that you need to do, right? You shouldn't need to prove your non-environmental benefits or go through this arduous council process. You just get it automatically.
Yep.
And then there also needs to be cases where you have a public benefit and you don't have on-site water treatment. It's not possible. There's no space for it, whatever. But the public benefit is so much that it's worth it, like South First Street.
And then that becomes part of that
and then you just drop the
Discretionary.
standard
Well, it
condition?
becomes part of your, yeah, you drop the standard condition.
Or for your standard condition, are you still imagining that goes through a discretionary process? Yeah, I mean,
You go in, you're coming in the door with, it's a discussion, still a discretionary review, but we've established essentially at a policy level that these are the set of conditions that we're gonna expect for most critical slopes, unless an argument, as you said, can be presented otherwise of why it's infeasible and the public benefit outweighs, even not having that.
yeah. I guess part of the problem again then is like, sometimes you think maybe it's possible, maybe not, until you do all the engineering.
I know.
And,
And then,
if you get to that point, you can only treat 95%.
and now you're
Then
hitting
you
on
don't
one of
even
the
know if-
challenges we have in this ordinance where we're talking about a fundamental threshold question of use of land, but then we're talking about a design attribute, site design attribute that is not really gonna be known and determined until you get much later in the process.
Yeah, or even you can treat 100%, but then it's denied by discretionary review for any other reason, right? Seems a little broken, still, which I guess is the process we have now, right?
There's no easy answers.
Yeah,
That's why we're here.
yeah. In terms of the natural value of slopes for Charlottesville's character, we spent a lot of time 2 weeks ago talking about how slopes, especially on roads, are very bad for people with disabilities. And while they don't violate the strict language of the law to have steep slopes, you're violating the spirit of the law by having slopes greater than 5% on sidewalks. To me, that need far outweighs the need to have a road be steep for, the city's character.
We're not talking about roads.
Well, sometimes we are. Depends on what the development looks like, right?
So it's-
Are roads exempt from critical slopes?
I think roads are considered part of the infrastructure that's exempt from
Hmm.
critical slopes. Point A and point B, the road standard still applies even if they're on a critical slope.
That's,
Yeah, but that's only if only if the area of the critical slope is only the area of the road. If you're then building houses on either side, you still have to get the waiver.
But they're competing contrary interests, because if I wanna flatten out a road, I gotta put slope somewhere else, right? And so if you're gonna take a hilly place and smooth out a road, you're creating more slopes.
Yeah, or a
Unless you
retaining
flatten the
wall.
whole city, or
Yeah.
retaining walls, but,
And I guess my vote would be for retaining walls where possible, which was my vote 2 weeks ago, but I thought about it a lot. And I mean, that was also whatever, that's its own thing for lots of reasons, but in general, like, if we could have said from the beginning, we're just gonna put a retaining wall there and it's gonna be fine, and it was on a street that didn't have problems bringing in fill, that would have clearly been preferable, I think. So speaking of the road exemption, a couple weeks ago, we were threatened, essentially, by a developer to say, if you don't give this to us, we're going to build a road, which will be exempt. By building the road, which will be exempt, we will pipe the stream, and then there won't be a stream, and so there will be no critical slopes on either side. And at that point, we'll be able to build the rest by right. Is that an accurate interpretation of the ordinance? It seemed plausible to an extent.
What do you?
yeah.
If there's no stream, how are they critical slopes?
Well, because you can't build a road, who's gonna build a road with no lots? They're not gonna subdivide it?
Well, they
They're
had
just
some
gonna-
lots. It was already platted. There were some buildable
Okay,
lots, and then the
that
rest of them would have
sounds-
been unbuildable or something.
Incredulous to me, I don't know, no. You wanna build a road?
Well, I think in the Isaiah Springs
This was-
example, you have
yeah.
the
It's
existing
previously
lots,
platted,
and you have the
right.
previously platted road, and I think that was their argument, is that,
But I don't think that road was the standard anyway, so it had to be the standard. You can't build a 10-foot wide road because someone platted in 1847 and then say we've eliminated they needed to subdivide that or whatever method it is to remove that lot, and then now you're recreating lots over the critical area, and it's unlikely that it would have gone like that. I didn't hear the presentation, that sounds a little crazy.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what they said. Shakti said it out loud, actually.
sure.
seemed a bit extortionary. I think those are my things.
Good things, thank you. I found the memo extraordinarily helpful, especially the background and understanding why we've gotten this thing and what it's done over time. The perspective that it was in place because there was no state program to do this work makes perfect sense to me. The ability to have that trade-off to say, okay, take the easy land, we're going to make it more expensive and hard to do the steep land, made sense because we had easy land to make that trade-off. Now we don't. Time has passed and that land is built up now. So we don't have that same kind of power that we did then. To the practical concern of how do we actually, do this, balancing all the issues of the city. I agree from a sort of a rational planning perspective that limiting it to environmental is a very smart move, just in terms of being able to do it and do it predictably. I really like the idea of shunting that kind of process off to a more reliable staff process. What really opened my eyes to this was the South First Street project, which we almost killed all that federal LIHTC funding because this process was so complicated and difficult. And that made me worry, what else isn't even happening because this process is in place to kill additional projects. I would like this process to not harm the public, and I would like to have some clear idea of a benefit to the public. And currently, I do see harm and I don't see benefit.
When you, just to more specific, you see harm in terms of
Killing good projects.
killing the projects.
I feel like we just grant waivers, and
A
then they're
lot.
not killed.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't personally know of a lot of projects we've killed over steep slopes.
In 4 years, I don't know that y'all have ever denied a critical slope waiver. I can't think of it.
So we threw the data in the memo, and
Oh,
I know
okay.
that over the last 4 years, there've been 16, I think it was 16 approvals, 2 withdrawals, and 1 that's still pending.
Yep.
Okay, close enough.
What I always want to note with that kind of data is sometimes a 95% approval rating is perfectly appropriate, because what we're not able to count is how many projects did not come forward.
Correct.
Right, we only have part of the data picture with that number. It's important to understand that that's with the approval rating, but how many projects turned aside, how many projects didn't materialize, just by virtue of the fact that the critical slopes waiver existed as a requirement? We don't know the answer to that question.
At least one of those withdrawals, Rayon, was a denial by us and then thinking they're going to get denied.
Sure.
And to me, the standard of does this ordinance have teeth is less, are we granting the waivers, and more, how good were the mitigations we required?
Right.
And in most cases, except for the fire station, which is a city project anyway, we're putting a lot of mitigation conditions on, I think, so.
There's also another element of allowing for public input on this
Yep.
stuff, which is very important.
I see we are 4 minutes over on this topic. Do we have any final comments on this before we want to move on?
I just wanted to follow up on what Liz said. So currently, critical slopes are not subject to public hearing, like, right, that's correct, yeah. So that has been a comment that's come up. That's something that I'm gonna look into whether there's any reason it could not be, but that's something you guys, I mean, just kind of quickly, what's your guys' sense? Would you prefer that there be a public hearing associated with your review of critical slopes, or would you prefer to keep it as is?
My preference would be to keep it as is. The reason that I would go that way is because folks still, at the beginning of the meeting and at the end of the meetings and council, in the council meetings, they still get to weigh in on their thoughts. And they still get to send us documents suggesting why we should or should not approve a critical slope.
I'd kind of go the other way. I mean, if the folks are weighing in the beginning, if they're going to weigh in on the critical slopes waiver, we can just kind of pull them to weigh in then instead of weighing in the beginning. It's almost the same thing. But they're weighing in when we have a chance to talk to staff and listen to the developer. So it might be more, time-wise, it just might link it to the project in a
Is-
better sense.
Sorry. One issue is that whether the public weighs in or not, we still don't have a clear tool by which to evaluate. And sometimes I think what we hear about are, the tree, tree protection, I think, I don't know, it's not a lot we can do with it. Yes, it's frustrating. The
I'm-
ordinance isn't better.
I am barely on Mr. Mitchell's side of this. Part of that has to do with the, and to sort of piggyback on a little what you said, that you get feedback about things that are still under this larger environmental issue that really isn't the critical slope piece. And secondly, that you get the same, I'm not sure how illuminating it is to the commissioners to have the public comment in the nature of a public hearing, in that, I mean, I find the written input on these, voluminous and fine, and I don't want to be in the situation where you have a concentrated group show up and give the perception of a very heavy opposition to something or a very heavy approval to something that isn't quite and it just seems to me that you're adding a position where you have yet another inflection point for that sort of, I just sort of see them in sequence. I mean, how many public hearings do you have about, particularly on the very technical matters? Particularly since, again, the public weighs in vociferously and repeatedly, and sometimes with great eloquence, but sometimes not. So, but I think I'm persuadable, but I think I'm on Mr. Mitchell's side of that.
I think that is a good point. I don't know that it's persuaded me, so I'm probably still on camp. I don't think it matters very much either way, unless it imposes some harsh notice requirements or expensive notice requirements. I find that on many projects, though not all, the public input is pretextual at best, and often on things that are not related to our standards of review, like traffic. Got that a lot in the Belmont condos, and it's seen as critical slopes. I think maybe the biggest problem with the process is that it's seen as this, a decision, like a rezoning or an SUP on the project itself and not about the slopes. I mean, I guess there's some validity to that if public benefits are non-environmental, and I think maybe that's a reason to kind of split those cases off into a sort of slightly separate thing, or thinking about it separately or differently. But in some ways, I think people want it to be a veto point, like a rezoning for projects they don't like, regardless of slope impacts. And I think that's probably bad and should be handled by zoning, which is why we have that.
Okay, sorry, I interrupted you as you were closing us out.
Oh, just my thoughts on this. If it's an environmental benefit, I don't think it's necessary to be a public hearing. If there is an environmental harm, but there are other public benefits, I certainly see some value of hearing the public. I don't know that it needs to be a public hearing.
Carl? Ms. Carl?
No, I agree. And I mean, your idea of breaking the thing up so that there's staff reviews the environmental stuff, and if we do public benefit, I mean, that makes a whole lot of sense to me. And yeah, that would be the point that we've got to hear from the public.
Are we good on this issue?
I guess the one last thing I'd add is the county has a similar system of critical slopes and call them preserved and managed slopes. And then sometimes they change preserved to managed. That's, I guess, the man-made versus whatever. But it seems to work decently well over there. I don't hear a ton of complaints. And so maybe, you know, consult with them about what they're up to. Their buffer ordinance, on the other hand, is a little bit more of a mess, but worth talking to our counterparts over there, at least.
Let's go downhill. Floodplains, please.
See what you did there.
Great. I know my audience. That's perfect. I don't think I've spoken with you guys before. I'm Andrea Henry. I'm the city's water resources protection administrator. So I do stormwater operations side, not so much involved with land development. And I also do a lot of master planning work associated with stormwater, which is why I'm the one chatting about this today. And so, if you want to pull up the presentation, just go to the second slide, that's great. So first of all, nobody is supposed to know anything about floodplains here. I got a lot of great questions prior to this meeting, and so it's great that everybody's trying to do their due diligence. What I'm trying to do here tonight is just create a playing field, right? So we're going to go over some basics. We're going to feel out the box that is, you know, development in the floodplain, and you know, the hope is that you guys can provide feedback then to city staff, ask targeted questions, and I can answer those, and we can all sort of move towards looking at ordinance revisions. You're not supposed to know anything yet. Okay, and so the lens we are looking through this, floodplain management as flood resilience, because what we're working on right now internally is a flood resilience plan for the city. And this is sort of under the umbrella of the climate adaptation and resilience that we're working on. I mean, we need to be resilient against conditions we have now, of course, but also in the future. So, kind of going through what's going to happen in the presentation, we're going to have a quick class in floodplain nomenclature. Everybody's going to pass with flying colors. We're going to talk about why we should even regulate development in the floodplain. What's the risk? What are we talking about here? We're going to talk about some different tools for resilience, flood resilience in general, that also apply to floodplain management. And then we're going to look at some examples. These are examples from the Association of State Floodplain Managers. They've been doing this for 20 plus years. And I love how they lay things out, because they kind of take an approach of, this is the basic, here's the better, here's the absolute best in terms of risk management. And then we'll briefly just talk about, there are some benefits to doing better. Okay, so we applied for this grant to do a flood resilience plan. Started working on it this summer. This is mostly an internal city staff effort at this point. We're going to take a phased approach. So right now, internal stakeholders, internal discussion, and then eventually it will be more public facing, where we'll have some community engagement. We had to talk very briefly about what resilience is. We can kind of look at this as a two-prong approach. One is mitigation. What are we doing physically to remove the risk? And adaptation. How can we respond and recover from the events that will occur? So, you know, we can look at mitigation sometimes as, you know, these huge infrastructure projects, right? So that's Floodwall Park in Richmond. And then we can look at adaptation as something like, you know, if we have a trail system in a floodplain or in a floodway, having information available to folks that may use that trail to get them out of harm's way. So the flood's still there, but we're doing something to reduce risk. Okay, and so this is kind of where Charlottesville is in the picture of the Rivanna watershed, which is what we look at when we're looking at our floodplains in the city. And so you can see here, just in terms of scale, you know, Charlottesville is a small portion of the overall watershed, but we do have a great deal coming through and around Charlottesville. you know, infrastructure projects like giant, retention ponds, detention ponds probably aren't gonna work on a scale in Charlottesville to effectively reduce risk. So we really look at, okay, what are the programmatic type things we can do to reduce risk in the city, such as our development ordinance. Okay, so this is our 101 class real quick. FEMA, there is a national flood insurance program. This started in the late 70s, and they said, hey, communities, if you come in and you adopt a minimum standard for floodplain development in floodplains, we will make insurance available to your community members, whether they live in the floodplain or not. The whole community can get flood insurance. Lots of localities signed on to this. But these are minimum standards. And so they even say in federal code that you can be more restrictive, it is allowed, and it's even encouraged. Okay, so these are the designations that FEMA, you'll see on a FEMA floodplain map. And these are important to talk about because what you can do development-wise in a floodplain is different depending on what section of floodplain you are in. So a floodway has different developmental standards than the 1% annual chance flood hazard area, which is a mouthful, the Zone AE floodplain.
And you absolutely are not able to build anything in a floodway, right?
That's right. Okay, so, and then they differentiate between Zone A and Zone AE floodplains. We're not even gonna get into that here. Zone A is sort of, I think of that as like the Bob Rossing of floodplains, right? So you're not doing it based on a model or a detailed study. It's sort of a picture on a map to provide guidance. Fortunately, we have very little of that in the city now, and with the new flood insurance study that's being done, that will be removed with a detailed study. So you can just wipe Zone A out of your lexicon now. We don't have to deal with it. This 1% annual chance flood hazard area, that's what commonly people will call a 100-year floodplain. And an engineer may slap my hand for that, but we're all friends here. This is a safe place. We can call it a 100-year floodplain, okay? The 0.2% annual chance flood hazard area, that's what people sometimes refer to as a 500-year event, and we do not regulate to that. So we're looking at floodway, 100% floodplain. And this is just how it plays out in a regulatory FEMA map. These are all the designations you would see in a plan view. Here. And then this is sort of the cross-section profile version. And so this is a good one to look at to figure out, okay, what is this floodway thing? What is it even supposed to mean? So what I probably should have pointed out on that first slide when we're looking at, you know, the definition of all these different things, for floodway, for Zone A, for Zone AE, it designates all of that as high risk. So this is not a risk definition. It's not as if you put 1 foot into the floodway, high risk, emergency, you take 1 foot out of the floodway, everything's good. This is not a definition of risk. It's really meant to look at the cumulative effects of development over time. So what FEMA does when they're developing floodplains, they say, okay, we're gonna designate a floodway. And what that's meant to do, we don't want anybody to develop in a floodplain in a way that is going to cause the water surface elevation of that 100-year event to rise more than a foot. But how do you determine that if you're doing parcel by parcel development, right? So they kind of do it for you preemptively. And so they say the floodway is the area where if you had encroached, that would, up to that point, you would have raised the water surface elevation 1 foot. So as long as you don't build in the floodway, you're not gonna meet, you're not gonna, exceed that minimum standard. But it is not a definition of risk. Okay, and so this is where we have regulatory floodplain in the city. So some of the standard players are there, the ones you would expect, the Rivanna, Meadow Creek, Morris Creek, those are our big ones. Rock Creek, which is in the southern portion of the city that feeds into Morris Creek. That's been a detailed study area since 2005. And then I put pictures up of these two, because these are not designations that we as community members use. This is a FEMA designation, and it doesn't necessarily tell you where it is. This Fifth Street Creek, it feeds into Rock Creek. It runs parallel to Fifth Street, the Fifth Street corridor. And it's just a little bitty section of stream there. And then North Fork Meadow Creek is running to Emmett before you hit Barracks right there. So these are the areas that we're talking about when we're talking about floodplain tonight. Okay, risk assessment. So when we talk about risk, what's the risk? Who's at risk? Why? That's it. So everybody passed floodplain 101. Congratulations. We're under risk. Okay. So FEMA put together this dashboard for us to discuss the new flood insurance study that hopefully is going to open for public comment this spring. This is sort of their dashboard, very concise way of looking at risk here in the city. And so some things I'll point out, we're not going to go over every one of these squares, but we do have claims that have occurred in the city of Charlottesville for properties that have experienced flood damage. Almost half of those properties are outside of the floodplain, so we have flood risk even outside of the floodplain. Flood damage has occurred, however, our 100-year 1% annual exceedance event has not. Some of these claims, you'll see this number 13 RL properties. That stands for repetitive loss. That means these are properties that experienced significant damage more than once in a 10-year period. So there are properties that have frequent damage. We've paid out, or not we, but insurance companies have paid out $400,000+ in damages, and they assess that we have 340 properties that are in or structures, not just properties, structures that are in a high hazard area right now.
So it says draft high hazard. Is that going to be a change to the boundaries?
So, yeah, if you want to go back, so they do an assessment, and I wish I could tell you exactly where these properties are. All we've seen are pretty high-level maps at this point and not profiles, and so it's hard to zone in. And we don't have GIS layers. That would be really helpful to be able to layer on our data to see, okay, what are these properties that are getting added? We don't have that yet. But what they're saying is we're going to be adding 200+ habitable structures to a high hazard area and removing a few.
FEMA is revising our floodplains, so
Yeah.
this is that draft. That's
Gotcha.
what's coming.
Yep.
Can I
Thanks.
ask a question that was in 101 and I'm still thinking about it?
Absolutely.
What does it mean, there's something about risk of waters going over a foot? Well, what is that, what are you talking about?
That is a FEMA regulatory standard. So when we talked about, we partner with the National Flood Insurance Program. They tell us what minimum standards are for development in floodplain. One of those minimum standards is that you cannot encroach on the floodplain in a way that increases the water surface elevation of the 100-year event over 1 foot.
I don't understand what it means.
Okay, so if your floodplain is this wide, and then you make it this wide, the water's going up. So they're saying
Make it
you,
this wide
You wanna go to the
with water.
section thing?
yeah,
Fill
Can we-
or
The bathtub
walls?
example, the more stuff you put in the bathtub, the higher the water
So,
level
like,
goes.
The amount of the building that goes in would displace the water by that much.
exactly. And so a lot of times when we're doing development in floodplains, we think about one house at a time, you know, and so maybe you can't see that
So,
effect.
Yeah.
And so developing the floodway is a way of seeing that effect preemptively
So,
before the development's actually there.
so instead of saying if you built like 30-foot walls at the edge of the floodway,
Yep.
then the flood level at each point would rise 1 foot.
Yes, correct. It would be, in theory, that's sort of what this illustrates.
Yeah.
You're not allowed to do anything in the floodplain that causes the floodwaters in a 100-year storm to go overflow. So what FEMA does is they do a little hydraulic exercise and say, we've already figured out this, if you do anything here, you're gonna make it close.
Okay.
But if you were to build this is the floodway where they've already determined if you screw it, that it makes it go up a foot. You could build an infinitely high wall here, and it would only go up 0.99999 feet regardless in a 100-year storm. Because of that.
So that's also the standard for like getting a fill permit, right? Like a Lomar F, that it won't cause it to go up over a foot. So in that case, is it automatically granted because it's not in the floodway?
You still have to do that analysis, and you have to elevate it up above that 1 foot. It depends
Okay.
on the scale, but that's her point, is that the minimum standard is that you can't do anything that causes it to go up 1 foot.
Yep.
And they've gone the extra mile and said, don't touch this area, or we're gonna consider that flood.
Gotcha. Thanks.
Follow-up question, what is the better and best foot difference? And does that increase our floodway?
We're gonna talk about that.
Okay.
Yeah.
And just to clarify, which is what Jackie just said, building in the floodplain does not affect our flood.
It can, and
Okay.
that's where you have, it depends on the scale, but typically you have to do a no adverse impact to prove that this doesn't cause the flood elevation to rise.
The reason that the state floodplain management association has been working on this for 20 years is there are some gaps in minimum standards, you know, so it doesn't completely make sense. It doesn't seem like our minimum standards cover every base in terms of no adverse impact or property to property impact, because it doesn't. Patrick, you wanna run through? Okay. Oh, wait, one back. There we go. Okay, so talking again about this, 100-year floodplain flood event picture, the reason engineers don't like to use this 100-year nomenclature is because it indicates falsely this is something that could only happen every 100 years. Where in theory, you could have back-to-back 100-year events because it's a statistical thing. There's a 1% chance every single year that this could occur. So, getting into the statistics muck is a mess. I'm gonna try to stay above that. But I'm gonna throw in some statistics here to sort of paint a bigger picture. A lot of times we think of the protect against these huge events like we see in the picture, right? Or like what's happening in California right now. The actuality is, as we saw in that dashboard, is that we do have flooding in and out of the floodplain, whether we have a 100-year event or not, and that statistically, very small amounts of water can cause very expensive damage to property. So these are statistics from FEMA. 1 inch of water in somebody's home can cause $25K in damage. Now imagine you don't have flood insurance, and your regular insurance is not going to cover that. If you own a home with a 30-year mortgage, if you plan on being there and paying off that mortgage in 40 years, you have a 1 in 4 chance during that time of flooding if you reside in a floodplain. So this is not a scenario where I'm not going to live here 100 years. I'm okay, right? That's sort of messing with statistics in a way that doesn't make it paint an accurate picture anymore.
Wouldn't the mortgage deal require you to have flood
That's
insurance?
a great question. If you have a federally backed mortgage, you are required, and you live in a floodplain, you're required to have flood insurance.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you're not.
You're actually required to prove that you're not in a floodplain.
Right, exactly.
And if you are, you must get help for
Mhm.
the insurance.
Yep. Yep. Okay, and so this is our inventory, just doing a quick GIS look at, okay, well, this is the who of the flood of risk, right? So the who of the floodplain. Let me see a little tight. Okay, so by parcel type, most of what we have in our floodplain is developed, right? So that's something to consider. A lot of times we think of, these are only cases of new development, but what about what's already developed? So whatever, when we think about ordinance, we need to think about that scenario as well. When we look at, okay, the developed parcels in the floodplain, a good portion of these are, from a plan view, they are in the floodplain. But the structure itself is not. that could be because they did exactly as you just referred to, where perhaps they built on fill, they showed that they're above the base flood elevation and they're no longer in the floodplain. Or perhaps it's a property where the floodplain does encroach on the property, but the structure itself is outside of it.
Quick aside to that, they make you sign a form that says, I understand a portion of my dirt is in the floodplain, and I am absolving everyone of all responsibility if my patio furniture floods away.
Sounds like you live in the floodplain.
Just a mortgage broker.
Oh, that's what it is, okay. But we do have habitable structures that are in the floodplain, and we have, that's hard to read, but I think it's 27 that are actually in the floodway itself.
I see 22.
Is it 22? Thank you for that. Okay. And then the small one at the bottom is just to show that overwhelmingly, we're talking about residential properties here. Okay, Patrick.
How does building and fill not negatively affect? Isn't that still displacing water?
Yep.
That's just a loophole?
No, I mean, it's not a loophole so much as, we're gonna talk about that in a minute. I'd like to put more context around that. Okay, so now let's talk about impacts. So we talked about the who's. What is the risk? What is the threat here? So we, during our flood resilience planning, we've had a team of folks in departments and divisions across the city that have had a series of workshops to talk through questions like this. What are the threats and consequences of flooding? Because for somebody that's operating CAT might be much different than it is for somebody that's concerned about our pipes and our inlets and things like that. And these are things that we came up with and then that we kind of added to based on literature that's out there, right? But there's some obvious ones, right? The big ones are, okay, somebody could get injured, somebody could lose their life. It could be a homeowner, it could be somebody driving their vehicle. Overwhelmingly, that's the case, where it's people in vehicles trying to cross roads. It could be your first responder. So that's kind of the worst case impact. We have, roads that are overtopped. We have infrastructure impairments. So think about all those cars against the bridges and culverts and what's happening there. Of course, people's homes flood. That's a huge one. And then there are other ones. It kind of goes down from there, right? We have erosion of waterways. You get gunk in the floodplain because water's going where it doesn't normally go and people are storing things there. Degraded aquatic environments. If those are streams that people use for recreation, that's lost for a while. You have interruptions to critical sectors, talking about road closures, things like that. Debris, cleanup, that's huge. And then, on a smaller scale, is that water able to go back, right, where we need it to be? So you can get standing water and icing conditions. That's very small scale stuff. And then we talk about the indirect impacts, what happens after, right? And it's really important to point out, and there's a lot of literature to confirm this, that indirect impacts, the economic impacts of flood events or natural hazards in general, do have disparate effects on people, depending on their income and depending on other factors that affect social vulnerability. Right? It is much harder for some people to recover from these types of events than others.
So to that very point, when we go back and look at the pie chart, what percentage of those folks who are living in floodplains are in lower middle to lower income demographics?
I think that would be really useful information to have. Most of what we have on income and factors like this is done at the census tract level. So we are not able to get granular data household to household.
I mean, the history of floodplains suggests that lower income people tend to populate
Right,
those areas.
yeah. Harder to develop, maybe lower cost to purchase, yeah.
I mean, it would be really nice to know that I know it's hard to do, but for us.
Yeah, agree.
We could at least use, value of the parcel as a proxy, maybe, which we have.
Yeah,
obviously.
yeah. That might be.
One other thing,
Can you speak a little bit about the current grant that we're trying to get and
Mhm.
what that grant could do? Is
Yeah, so we're definitely, so we have identified a need for this kind of data, at least on a neighborhood scale, if not on a household scale, through many of the planning efforts that we've undertaken across the city, not just to do with stormwater. When you're trying to prioritize projects, when you're trying to do master planning for about anything, when you're trying to apply for grants to do projects, this is data that is really valuable. And again, most of what we receive is census tract, which can be deceiving because it's too big. So we're looking for ways to, it might be using data that we already have, but figuring out how to put it together, and then, what data is missing to come up with something that is scaled for our community. And yeah, there's a grant opportunity right now that we're gonna apply for. I think it's through the Park Service, which seems a little random, but it would, if we were able to get this product, it would be useful across the city for a lot of what we do.
It seems like the number of parcels too is small enough that maybe you could just go ask everybody
We can brute
to.
force it.
Yeah.
Just door to door. Yeah.
Or
I mean,
start with
yeah.
a mailing, just follow up door to door.
Yeah.
No,
maybe
how
so.
many of them are getting property tax relief?
Mhm.
There's one.
Yep. Yep.
Okay, sorry.
But
I just see one thing missing on this list, having lived in New Orleans, and it's not, maybe it's implied, but mold in buildings after
Mhm.
flooding
Absolutely.
is,
Yeah.
which should help like physical health probably.
Right. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah, we have sort of the immediate health effects, but there are certainly lingering health effects as well. Okay, so I am going to use the rest of this time to talk through some examples of things that we can do to the development ordinance to make it more restrictive. And I am using a roadmap provided by the Association of State Floodplain Managers. These are two documents that I can provide you guys. I really like them. They're both about 100 pages each, but they're pretty high level and they're well organized. This first one talks generally about all of the tools that you can use for floodplain management. And I listed them out here because they also overlap tools we would use for flood resiliency in general, and that we will talk about in our flood resiliency plan. So the mapping itself, education and outreach, right? We saw there's signs on the trail, planning, but the regulations and development, that's what we're talking about today. Mitigation, infrastructure, those are things. Infrastructure is a segment of mitigation, right? It could also be something like buying out properties. And then our emergency response. And then we talk about in both of these documents, again, the basic, the better, and then this no adverse impact, which is kind of the hard line of development in floodplains. Okay, so just wanted to revisit this one more time, because we're gonna start talking about things, and we're gonna talk about the flood fringe, which is that area of the floodplain that is not the floodway on the sides, and the floodway, because different development standards depending on where you are. Okay. All right, so first we're gonna tackle new development in floodplains. There are basically two kind of heavy hitters in terms of making things more restrictive, and that is these here. We're talking about freeboard and we're talking about encroachment. So first we're gonna live on the flood fringe, so this is out of the floodway. Our current standard is that you have to be 1 foot, your finished floor elevation has to be 1 foot above your base flood elevation. That's your 100-year water surface elevation, base flood elevation, same thing. This is the one area where we're already more restrictive than the minimum, because the minimum says you just have to be at the base flood elevation, and we say 1 foot above. And then for non-residential properties, we say, there are quite a bit of flood proofing things you have to do. We can be more restrictive based on that code section. We could say you need 2 feet of freeboard, 3 foot, whatever, 2.5, 2.7. You get the idea. We're just being more restrictive in terms of requiring more freeboard. The most restrictive thing you can do is, of course, say you can't develop in the floodplain, period. I want to segue just a little bit off on a tangent here, because I've heard a lot about, wait, that's what Albemarle County does. And I want to clarify something, because that's not quite true. But I understand why people think that way, because you go to their code of ordinances, there's this nice table and it talks about habitable structures, and there's a big N when it says develop in the floodplain. But what this is referring to is they cannot develop by right in the floodplain. Not that they can't at all. If they go through the process of doing the fill, getting the Lomar F, there's a good chance that they can develop in the floodplain. So really, our ordinances are not much different. They're just laid out differently.
And when you say doing the fill, you're talking about just elevating the property above the flood.
Exactly.
But
Doesn't
they-
that only to mitigate the risk of that property and not the downstream
Yes.
issue?
Yes.
Okay.
But
Which
they-
is essentially what ours does now too, yeah.
And they do require an SUP for fill though, right?
I believe they do, yes. You do have to go through the special use permit.
Well, you just said it. That's essentially what ours does too. So how does, and maybe you'll get there, maybe we'll get that when we start talking. How does our ordinance differ from Albemarle's ordinance?
So not much. So there is this special use
That they can-
permit
yeah.
that they have to get. So that's one more, I guess, hoop to jump through. It gets maybe some public attention, where our ordinance says as long as you've, completed the Lomar F and the elevation certificate, this is kind of a staff level process.
But so the other option besides fill is just like build on stilts, right?
Yep.
Can you do that in the county
Yep.
without a Lomar F? And so then
Yeah.
is it by right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Now, that's a good question, is it by right? I think nothing is by right in the county. I think even if you did, and I'm kind of out of my lane here, right? I don't work for the county, I work for the city. But yes, I think you'd still have to go through the special use process, but you wouldn't have to get the Lomar F.
So what does the engineering oversight look like for it? If we were able to say, you're not gonna build on, you're not gonna be able to build in floodplains unless you do these mitigation things. What kind of stuff would you be asking a developer to do to build them?
So I think we'll touch on that, but a lot of it is not mitigation, it's saying, this is one of many slides about how we can improve the standards, but like this slide, and Liz, you would sort of address this correctly, is that the minimum standard, in the country, nowhere are you allowed to build so that a finished floor of a habitable structure is underneath that floodplain, at least at the floodplain elevation. We require 1 foot, we could require 2 or 3 feet. Of course, if we require 10 feet and everybody's bringing a gazillion dump trucks of fill, we're complicating things even further. But that, we don't do very much from an engineering standpoint. We analyze, we say, looks like you've triggered this, you would say no adverse impacts that demonstrate hydraulically you're not going above 1 foot. That's sort of the limits of what engineering does.
I just actually want to just check, is everybody understanding that we think the floodplain is a three-dimensional space, that you can get out of the floodplain by going up or going away? We all get that? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, but the water still goes somewhere
Yeah, the water always still goes somewhere, but yeah.
faster
But-
and
but-
more intense.
As long as you're up and away from it, you're okay.
Still mitigated that. Right.
Yeah. Okay, so that's when we're developing in the flood fringe. We're talking about freeboard. When we're trying to develop in the floodway, we're talking about encroachments. The way we define, and so this is really more of a definition of floodway than a development in the floodway discussion, right? Because we have defined our floodway as FEMA has defined it, which is that you can have this maximum encroachment of 1 feet. We can make that more restrictive. We can say, no, the maximum encroachment is half a foot, or 0.75 feet. You get the picture. Less than 1 foot, right? So that makes the floodway wider, and that's more area within the floodplain itself that you cannot develop.
So that's not saying that we're allowing development in the floodway right now? Right, everyone gets that?
Right. This is more of how we're gonna define the floodway as a city. Yeah.
FEMA's already designated the floodways where if you touch it, you increase the water by a foot, and what we do is say, well, we don't want that definition, we want to broaden it where if you touch it, it would rise 0.5 feet.
So as you go down on the right-hand side, as that standard, as the number goes down, the extent of floodway goes farther out.
Do you guys have a map of what that would look like? Like how big would the floodway be if it was a full conveyance floodway?
So the
So
floodplain
if
would
it was-
be coincidental.
Yeah, if it was full conveyance, that would be equivalent to the floodplain itself, which is
That makes
essentially the
sense,
same thing
yeah.
as you can't develop in the floodplain.
Okay.
Yep.
Oh, that's what that little arrow at the bottom
Yeah,
is.
yeah.
Equivalent.
So,
You guys are way ahead of me, yeah.
I have been telling the public, and perhaps I've been incorrect, that we can't just ban development in the 100-year floodway, is that, or in the 100-year floodplain, is that not accurate?
We cannot do what?
Just ban all development?
I mean, no, people do that. You know, it depends on, you know, what we have the appetite for. We absolutely are allowed.
If someone already
by FEMA
owns
to
a
make
parcel.
Yeah, it's a takings issue.
Yeah, we can't right now, because that's not what our ordinance says.
I think that the most restrictive option here is essentially banning development for them, but there is still the takings issue, and I would want to investigate that further.
Yeah, because that's a great segue into the next discussion, which is redevelopment in the floodplain, because we gotta consider the fact that there are people already living in floodplains, right? Patrick, if you wanna go to the next one. Okay, so this is what we say now about redevelopment. We talk a lot about substantial improvements. Everything sort of hinges on this substantial improvement thing, which is essentially, if you're gonna make an improvement, it's defined as substantial if it is 50% of the market value, current market value of the home. So what we say now is, in the flood fringe, that's that part that's not the floodway, you can't do substantial improvement unless you have met our code, right? Unless that freeboard requirement is there and the building code is met. But we don't really talk about substantial improvement, the frequency, right, of substantial improvement. Because what if you had a home that was significantly damaged one year, but it was a little bit under that substantial improvement definition, right? And they rebuilt, and then the next year, there was significant damage again. That's kind of an indication that maybe that's not a great place for a home to be, at least how it's, you know, built now. So something that we could do that would be more restrictive is to take a cumulative look at that substantial improvement definition and say maybe it's a 10-year period, right? And so if you have improvements over this period, you know, we add them all together.
So rebuilding is considered an improvement?
Mhm.
Okay.
It's just a monetary really definition.
Mhm.
It could be, you know, rebuilding because you just want something. It could be rebuilding because there was damage. Yeah.
Is this an active problem?
I mean, we don't really, is it an active problem?
I mean, is it no?
Like, do we have lots of cases a year where we're looking at substantial improvement? No. No, we don't.
Hopefully we have all these conversations to iron this out before we get a rain event that makes all this a very poignant problem for all of us.
And then of course, the most restrictive, we're running on a common theme in this category, right? Is a general no.
Yeah.
So you can't do anything that's considered a substantial improvement if you are in the flood fringe.
So that, just to clarify, that
yeah.
would mean if someone's currently has a house 2 feet above the base flood elevation in the fringe,
Mhm.
we have a really big flood, the first floor gets washed out,
Mhm.
they have to tear it down. Is that what the third one is saying?
Well,
That,
no, they're
well,
saying they have to elevate it out.
Well, no,
Well,
no
that's the first
substantial
one.
exactly,
improvement.
yeah,
So
because
we are
probably
saying they
there's
can't
nothing
rebuild.
you could do that would, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so to
Move
Jack's
on that.
point, it really isn't about, oh, I want to add, you know, an addition. It's like, if there's a flood event that has impacts, you can't redo it, right? So it's almost like an unmanaged retreat,
Interesting.
where once you're flooded, we say, sorry, you're done.
Right, right, and so these are the sort of implications that we wanna consider when we're considering the floodplain ordinance. How does this affect people that already reside here? Okay, so floodways, again, we're talking about this encroachment thing. Okay, what we say here is there is no substantial improvement, period, unless you can show this no adverse impact, right? And so this is something we're gonna talk about in the next few slides, no adverse impact, and that no adverse impact is kind of everything that you've been referring to, right? Well, you know, taking up volume and velocity and erosive conditions, it's very general here. Something to think about is just to take that no adverse impact out of our ordinance and just say no substantial improvement in a floodway. Because I think we know that anything that you're gonna do in a floodway is probably gonna have an impact. I mean, that's the whole definition of being outside of a floodway. So why do we wanna open this door to, analysis and back and forth when we really know we don't want development in a floodway to So that's something to consider. I'm waiting, I'm pausing, because it seems like
Well-
it's about to come out.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I was gonna wait, but like,
Okay.
I guess maybe part of the problem is like, there are a bunch of things in the floodway now that are bad to have in the floodway, and that could cause like serious environmental problems if and when they get flooded. Like, I don't know, a whole bunch of cars sitting in a parking lot of a body shop, where you might wanna have an incentive to make that use go away and, or move somewhere else.
Yeah.
And that would almost enshrine that use. It's staying there until it's flooded.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah. Okay, and then fill, we're talking about this fill. So, this is where that no adverse impact really comes into play, because we talk about cumulative impact, right? So, right now, in the flood fringe, we say you can put fill there, the minimum necessary, and it has to have some sort of certification to say that everything's up to snuff, right? The house is not gonna slide off of the slope. There are things you can do to make this more restrictive. One is compensatory storage. So to say, if you fill in this location, you have to cut in another, because we don't wanna reduce the volume of storage we have in our floodplain period.
To dig a hole over here.
Yeah.
If you fill here, you have to dig a hole over here.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of to Liz's point about the cumulative effect of
Mhm.
building in the floodplain. At some point, it is gonna make a difference. And that would be where if we enact something like this, then the engineering department would say, hey, we look at the comps.
Got it.
Mhm. Exactly. Something else we may wanna look at is dry land access, right? Just because you put your home on fill, it doesn't mean it's accessible, in flooding conditions, right? So how are emergency vehicles gonna get to you? So adding a dry land access requirement, to make sure that you can get out, or somebody can get to you, should this event occur. And then we can also look at more specific requirements for fill. So right now, we say you need certification. If we wanna take more responsibility in defining what that certification say, there are things we could do to have, more detailed, definitions of what acceptable fill is. And these are just some examples here, but you could have, a minimum compaction, maximum slope, maximum slope there. We could also say you can't put fill in the floodplain. Everything has to be piers, pilings, flow through, crawl space, because we do not want that volume taken with fill. There's also something to be said for filling in the floodplain and having adverse impact on the natural function of the floodplain itself. So this is more of an ecological water quality thought process.
so piers are still allowed in the no-fill situation? So like, I'm thinking about the Rivanna
Piers
Bridge.
are allowed now.
But if you,
Yeah.
if you said no-fill in the floodway, and could you still build a bridge across to Pantops? I mean, I guess it's not exactly fill.
Private,
What?
a private bridge?
Even, and this applies publicly too, right?
So, no, you are, if you build a bridge, the city county would have to show that there's no adverse impact. We can't build a bridge that causes it to rise.
Under the current rule, and so if you went
Under- yes.
to the more restrictive, none at all, even after, like, not the demonstrate no adverse impact, does that mean it would have to be like a suspension bridge? With no-
You might, that's an interesting question. I've never encountered that, not being a bridge builder or a bridge engineer, but, there's gotta be a way around that. But, yeah, I mean, it's not like the Ravenna is so large, like we're building a true suspension bridge, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And then, I just imagine bridge designers have ways to split into two piers if that's really the concern. You can also shape the pot, they don't have to be rectangles coming out of the ground, they can be hydrofoils and things like that to work with that.
Yeah, I guess we're in like public project space thought process now, right?
Yeah.
So, it's gonna be pretty hard, so, suspension bridge, holy smokes, that's gonna be costly, right? So typically.
Well, even the regular bridge is so costly, it'll probably never get
Totally,
funded,
totally.
so.
These are big projects, so typically what you would do, you would design the bridge or the culvert system. You would have a hydraulic model that showed the impact, and then you would have a LOMAR that you submit to FEMA to revise the regulatory floodplain. If it's already, if the rise and the expansion is on public property, okay, we're good. That's why it's great. Parks, floodplains are symbiotic, partners. I love it. If it's a case where, it's on private property, so what we would do when I worked in Austin is we would try to get easement on those properties prior to even submitting the LOMAR. But it's gonna be pretty hard bridge or culvert system if there wasn't one there before and not have any impact.
Hmm.
Yeah. And then, okay, so talking about fill in the floodplain, or floodway, it's allowed. It's allowed. We just have this demonstrate no adverse impact thing, which, again, do we really believe that you can put stuff in the floodway and have no adverse impact? If we don't believe that's true, we should probably take that out as a qualifier and just say no fill in the floodway. Okay, this is wordy. Whew. So now we're going to talk through map revision processes. So if you guys saw that presentation that we gave to council, I'm sure you remember every presentation you've seen, right, in the last year. We talked about, the LOMAR process. Anybody can apply for a map revision. Yes, go for it. You do all the right stuff, we can consider it. But here's the thing. Here's the thing about that process. Right now, what we say in our code, that's that top square there, is that we're kind of implying that, you need to notify FEMA by applying for a conditional letter of map revision. So first, we are saying, look, if you're intending to develop this property, the process is this conditional letter, which includes the development on it. But we mostly just talk about going to FEMA. What I like better is, I came from Austin, so it seems random, but it's not random to me, and I'm familiar with it. I kind of like the way that Austin talks about it, because they say, hey, look, you have to have the community, the city's endorsement for this. So you have to come to us first. And then we can go and forward this information to FEMA for evaluation, should we agree and support what you've submitted. And that actually is more aligned. What Austin is saying is more aligned with what federal code says the process is. They say, we are the CEOs, we administrators of this ordinance, right? We're the CEOs of the community. So we're really ultimately responsible here for what our floodway and floodplain designations are, because we have to do the floodplain management. So I think, regardless, this isn't really a more restrictive argument here, and this is more definition, right? We want to make sure we're aligned with federal code. We want things to come to us first. There's nothing wrong with this first thing of going to FEMA, right? Lots of people want to participate. Lots of communities want to participate in the flood insurance program. They want that insurance for their residents. But they may not have the staff to review these things. And they may say, FEMA, I want you to look at it, right? And that's perfectly acceptable. But that's not what we want. We want to do that. We're the CEOs. We have the staff. We have the expertise. We want it to come through us first. So I think that we need to clarify that in our ordinance. And I love that the city of Austin also has a whole appendix talking about here's the process, here's what we need to see, depending on what scenario you're in. So we're just making it easier for our own projects. A lot of our projects are in the floodplain, and for third parties.
So how would that work, given that lots of our floodplains are shared with the county?
Right.
Could they just go through the county's process instead and bypass us, or would we?
Both. They do both.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, we can go to the next one. Okay. The other thing is, as much as we might like to bend a federal agency to our will, right? Maybe we need to be realistic. Like, if we want to be empowered as a locality, what can we do? First, we do want to see things first. We want to weigh in first and decide if we support it or if we don't. But here's something else we can do, and this is in our current ordinance. We can identify local flood hazard areas. Essentially, that's our own floodplain, floodway. that we designate. And we can identify these, and we can say, our floodplain development ordinance applies to this, right? We can't change insurance. Insurance is always gonna be regulated by FEMA, and FEMA's regulatory floodplain. But development in our own ordinance, we could have this LFHA.
So I'll just, as an example of that, so where I was in the Boston area, it was very common where there were formerly ponds or wetlands that had been filled and neighborhoods developed on top. Those areas continued to flood because water continues to go to the low point. And so many communities had designated those as part of their floodplain ordinance, even though they were not on the FEMA maps.
Yep, exactly. So we already have that option. Now, big asterisk here, it does have to be approved by council. We can't just as staff say, this is what it is now. So one example of making our floodplain development ordinance more restrictive through this avenue, we can say, we like the 2005 FEMA study. We really agree with the methodology there, and that's what we want to develop to. Going to most restrictive, this is kind of calling, every example of what some other communities do into one example, right? But, some communities say, we want to look at fully developed conditions across the watershed. We want to look at climate-influenced storm events for our floodplains. Now, we haven't seen a lot of that yet, but I wonder if it's coming. We can say, we want our floodplains to cover more area, so all streams with contributing drainage areas over 60 acres, that's made up. But you see what I'm saying? We can define it in a way that makes sense to us and our community. It can be very tailored.
But we'd have to create those models. They don't exist yet.
For that most restrictive, yes. For this one, no, it exists.
Some of that is not necessarily under development for here's the 100-year floodplain throughout the city, but we're working on, through the resilience of flood models, more of like smaller scale floods like that, and our infrastructure causes, which will then in turn inform that if we identify areas that, this culvert is undersized, either we replace the culvert, which would be a better idea, or we designate a flood area or something like that.
Yep.
Okay, and this talks about this a bit tonight, so it's interesting to see it through the lens of floodplain management and flood resiliency, because mostly when we're talking about floodplains, we're talking about moderating flooding, right? But there are natural floodplain functions, things that help us maintain water quality, they recharge groundwater. When you have big flood events, if you have that flood bench, that flood fringe, that's a natural place for sediment to drop out and deposit. That's why people farmed there, right? Because over time, right, there's like really fertile soil associated with that floodplain function. It can reduce erosion, and of course, it can provide habitat. So if we're gonna look through the context of zoning, what we have right now is in our water protection ordinance, which is exactly what you guys have already spoken to tonight, that 100-foot stream buffer that applies to Morris Creek, Meadow Creek, and the Raganum. If we wanted to be more restrictive, I wonder, would it make a difference if this was in a zoning overlay versus a water protection? I don't know. I don't know the question to that. So that's the first thing. Do we want that to be part of a development ordinance? And then, we could look at all kinds of different things. If we want, as part of our, development standards to be improving natural function, we can look at, well, maybe we expand the minimum setback for what we already have. Maybe we have a setback that's not just a hard minimum. Maybe it's based on something. Maybe it's based on the flow you see through that floodplain or the contributing drainage area. Maybe it's based on an erosion hazard analysis, right? So what does that stream bank look like already? If it's in great shape and it's sort of, it's not set to change over time, maybe you don't need as much of a setback as you would need if you see something that's very eroded and likely to erode in the future. We could also look at kind of what we talked about, the critical environmental features, right? Where we talked about our local flood hazard areas. So that's kind of overlapping with the last slide. So there are lots of things to consider here. And the good news here is that a more restrictive ordinance does have benefits. A big one, the most direct benefit, is that we can participate in the community rating system. This is something that's done through FEMA. So this says, you can participate if you do things above and beyond what you have to do as part of the National Flood Insurance Program. And if you participate, and based on what level of participation you have, we will give you a reduction in insurance premiums. So that's great, right? Because one of our tools is education and outreach. So we want to tell people in the floodplain, out of the floodplain, flood insurance might be a good thing for you. And by the way, we've done all this work, and your premium, you're going to get a 35% discount because we've done all of these things here. So we've made it affordable for you. So that's a very direct benefit. Another benefit is sort of this local empowerment option, right? Where we want first say, where we want something tailored to our community specifically and our needs. Of course, we are long-term reducing risk, reducing cost associated with damage from these events if we have less there. And then we can just have more effective programming if we're more clear about what we want, and if we are considering ordinances that have multiple objectives.
Where are we currently in the big table?
0. We
Oh,
don't
we
participate
don't
right now.
Okay.
We're
We are
too
class
lenient.
10. And now, there are probably some things we do now that we could be participating right now. It might not be high on the chart, but certainly having a more restrictive ordinance gets us up there. So there's a lot to consider here, and that's kind of all I wanted to do tonight, is to show you that there's a lot to consider, to pique your interest. If I do my job well, maybe you'll ask me back and ask for some specific recommendations about how we can achieve this. Because, you know, besides what I presented here, there are also considerations for, you know, the development community, folks that live in floodplains, and staff, right? Some of these things reduce staff effort, some may increase.
We are a little bit over time, but this was a big, complicated issue. Do we want to do a quick round on this one?
I've got, this was great. Wow.
Oh, good.
I mean, I kept up with you, which is remarkable. I think I would certainly be leaning towards a more restrictive embrace of the ordinance revision, so that we can start moving towards class 1 in the community ratings. So to that end, why wouldn't we require a waiver for anything that's going to be built in the floodplain to be reviewed by the engineering department based on some of the things you've outlined there, and things being more restrictive, and then to be approved by. Why wouldn't we
Just do that now.
yeah, just go to a waiver.
Say-
You got to have a waiver.
You gotta have a waiver.
And then in the ordinance outline where it makes sense, a list of the more restrictive things that would support getting a waiver.
That's certainly an idea, and I think on the writing of the ordinance front, it's simple. On the implementing the ordinance, it might be more difficult, because I think the FEMA dashboard talks about 340 properties that are already developed. I think what we showed in JS was something close to 600. So that's 600 potential detailed reviews for staff to do, hopefully on a consistent basis, but, you know, the ordinance is there to provide some consistency.
Again, I think
Yeah.
getting there, I mean, we can't do it today, but I think we ought to be able to iterate our way to a more restrictive ordinance. And again, we ought to be able to iterate pretty quickly towards getting waivers, having to get waivers to build in floodplains.
Yeah.
Thank you. Mr. Duranzio?
So, a couple of data questions. The $441,000 in paid claims, what was the period of time for that?
So that was since I believe it's from 1979.
So we've had, in
Flood
50
insurance claims.
50 years, we've had less than $500,000 in flood insurance claims.
But
All
we
right.
only have 90 policies to date. and
Right.
We have 600 properties. So I wouldn't take that as a picture of overall.
It's not,
So-
I wasn't
Yeah.
looking at it in
Yeah.
terms of the events, I was thinking in terms of purely as the finances. Okay. So we've got 600 parcels, can we interpolate them on the FLUM? I presume we can?
Future land use map. Comp plan.
I mean,
If you have them geo-referenced, we can
Yeah.
put them on top of anything.
All right.
we have that overlay in JS. Okay, and yes.
All right. So if we're gonna, if we would expand a limited flood hazard area with some sort of restrictions on it, there's really nothing stopping the city from providing a self-insurance model, or the city doing a self-insurance model if we designate things that way, right?
That's way out of my lane.
Yeah.
For what?
Well, if you're out of FEMA, right, if you're out of the floodplain, but you're still in a special flood hazard area that is not covered by the FEMA flood insurance, you've got people who are,
Well, you can still
Yeah.
get flood insurance
yeah,
through the federal market.
yeah,
and
I
you
under-
can still get the credits if we
right.
participate in
But
it.
of course, what we haven't discussed here is that program is in trouble in 3 or 4 different directions. And it's not gonna get fixed soon, because it's gonna require congressional action to fix it. And that's not gonna happen in the next 2 years. But, okay, and then, so I was asking about the self-insurance for I mean, there's nothing really to stop us. Okay, and then, do we, where are we with, do we have stilted properties in the city?
I can think of a few.
I mean, not a lot.
Not a ton.
Yeah, I'm thinking a few of them down along,
At Blue House on Nassau. there's some
Nassau's, exactly,
Baylor,
that's right.
There's one in Willow Mills.
And there's one in Mullen Mills, yeah,
on
okay.
Riverside.
Yeah, I've got other things, but the time factor being what it is, we'll just,
Okay. Mr. Abad?
Yeah, I'm also in favor of more restrictive. I think one thing we vaguely touched upon is habitat also. I'd like to hear more, there's a quick way to kind of summarize, we have a lot of the floodplain right now that's kind of along the Rivanna, and we have the urban Rivanna corridor plan too. And it seems like the more restrictive this is, it kind of feeds into the goals of the urban, or how does that mesh with the urban Rivanna corridor plan, is one thing to keep in kind of consideration when we look at this again. And I was hoping if Steve Gaines is here to briefly touch upon the sensitive areas around the Rivanna and the floodplains. He's not here. Okay, never mind.
that was brief.
It'll be interesting to continue the conversation and see what increasing that 1 foot to 2 or whatever we want to do does. How much area does it impact? Would we then have a takings issue if we stop development in some of these parcels? The way I look at this is also, it could be we have 3 different buckets of developed parcels, undeveloped parcels, and then kind of the habitat wildlife impact. And when we get new applications, they can fall into these different categories, I suppose. Would we want to make a distinction between the 1% and the 500-year floodplain? How does that?
Yeah, right now we don't really regulate at all to the 500-year floodplain. In some localities, you'll see for critical buildings, schools, hospitals, things like that. They may have some regulations to say, we want you even out of the 500. We don't have that. But there hasn't been a lot that I've seen that is directly regulated to the 500.
I think that's it. My biggest concern also on building, in the flood plain, get my terms right. If a person wants to go build a mound and build a house on top or put stilts, whatever. But there's a lot of public infrastructure impact too that the cities have to pony up to fix continuously, and that I think is one of my bigger concerns too with having that be allowed. But that's it for me. Thanks.
Ms. Russell?
So I think it makes a lot of sense to have a waiver or SEP process in place to allow the public to weigh in on things that have literally downstream effects, it seems like. And I generally, am interested in and supportive of restrictions on new development. I have a lot of concerns over restricting rehabilitation or, you know, rebuilding, but mainly repairing damage to existing buildings in the floodplain. And I didn't see if, you know, there was something that had a provision about elevating a building if, you know, event occurs, or something that's sort of like, what else could someone do, absent nothing, if their home was damaged or building was damaged?
Yeah, so the current ordinance talks about, you know, if it's the flood fringe, right, not the floodway, you can still improve, you just have to meet the requirements, so like you just said, elevating, and then you're good to go. Yeah, something to consider is maybe for, you know, if we saw, this cumulative effect of, right, substantial damage, or if we knew there were areas that we could have some sort of voluntary backup. So you're not completely stuck. So that, it may be that if we consider one thing, we want to consider the other as well.
Thank you.
Mr. Schwartz?
Yeah, you guys just said what I was concerned about, which was, yeah, you've got a homeowner there that's got a house that, you know, it's all they've got, and it gets damaged, and they lose everything. You know, just make sure that we don't make it so restrictive that you can't. Yeah, I mean, a buyout program sounds like a great way to get people out of the floodplain, which maybe that is what we should do over time, is how do we compensate people to get them out of that area? Of course, I just add that to the CIP, I guess.
Right. Yeah.
Well, I would counter that, you know, maybe a program to do building elevation would be an alternative. You know, there was something that said no adverse effect, and one potential adverse effect would be the loss of a historic building in a National Register district, like Woolen Mills, you know, comes to mind. Do we as a city want to potentially be losing those structures, or do we want to preserve them?
That kind of goes into your conversation about public good.
Yeah.
Historical building versus more additional floodplain, if the property was vacant, and then you can decide which one helps the community better.
Mr. Stolzenberg?
I think it's reasonable to plan for larger rain events as climate change progresses. To me, the most obvious and unobjectionable way to do that is to increase freeboard requirements. I don't really see any downside to saying your front door needs to be 3 feet above the floodplain instead of 1. It doesn't seem like it really has much negative impact on, or is very difficult to comply with even. I'm more skeptical about, I think ultimately we need to make a choice about what we want the floodplain to be. Whether we want it to be a sort of managed urban floodplain where we, you know, have people live in it, or whether we should really let it return to wilderness and do an organized managed retreat, and not let people live in the floodplain or rebuild their houses after they've been flooded. And I think anywhere in between is kind of diluting ourselves by saying we're going to let this sort of thing happen over and over, just as long as you're not living in a new apartment. And it doesn't seem like you get any advantage by restricting to single-family homes or whatever. Certainly no advantage of everything being a 1-story building versus a 5-story building, because the people in the top 4 stories certainly have lots of freeboard for their floors. And I think a lot of, obviously there's one particular thing happening now that none of this will probably happen in time to matter for, but that's driving a lot of, again, pretextual talk about the floodplain because they don't like the idea of tall buildings, but doesn't entirely have that much to do with it. I think before I would be willing to restrict fill in the floodplain, I'd like to have a much better understanding of what the effects of that fill are. Like, is it downstream effects from the water moving faster? Is it upstream effects from the water backing up? What are the things that are downstream? I mean, there are parts of the Rivanna where the things downstream, like, there isn't much. There's lots of natural floodplains with no structures in it, especially, you know, as you get past the confluence, Morse Creek, though that's not in the city.
Rory, one thing, just in direct response to the, whether we should do this or that in the floodplain, keep in mind too that the ordinance and controls are only one tool, right? There's infrastructure, there's things that could be done to try to prevent that incident from happening, not just respond to it, like a seawall or something like that. I mean, that's dramatic, but like, there's other strategies.
Yeah, and I mean, similarly, like, you would imagine that Phil would, if I'm, in the 500-foot floodplain maybe, and someone over here is in the floodplain is trying to put in a bunch of fill, I would intuitively think, but I'm not an engineer and don't know about any of this stuff, that would help me, right? That I would be less likely to have the Rivanna flood my house because there's this big berm in the way that almost acts as a levee. I don't know. I mean, I think these things are complicated, right?
Create a channel that goes directly
Right
to
to your house.
I think it's easy to say, to make, sweeping, let's not do anything there. I'm afraid of unintended consequences. In particular, I'm afraid of locking in all the really bad land uses we have in the floodplain, especially on river or road, where we want that stuff to change. And ideally, I mean, if we had a ton of money, a couple $100 million, we could probably buy it all and, return it to a natural state. We don't at the moment. Damn schools are always making us pay for things. But it would be a lot better to have, no habitable space in the ground floor and then a building with floors above, rather than, a lot of expensive business or whatever happening on the ground floor in the floodplain, in the floodway. And that's kind of what you could be incentivizing locking in if you write this ordinance badly. So,
That's a really good point about incentivizing change.
As for me, I give a wandering email with a lot of questions and confusion, and I'm moderately less confused, although I'm not entirely there yet.
Okay.
A big one, because of an application that we've seen recently, is parking. Parking is so much land use. It takes up so much space. And I'm not convinced that the best use of the floodplain is to fill it in for surface parking. If there's a way to treat different land uses differently, to give different priority, I think that would be a helpful way to think about it. Something I've seen in other places is parking under the structure, and then the structure itself is elevated. That seems reasonable to me.
It comes into play where the standard is, if I remember correctly, that the minimum fill necessary. And what is the definition of minimum fill necessary? Is minimum fill necessary inclusive of the surface parking lot, or is it only inclusive of the footprint of your apartment building?
I have a perspective on that. I think it's the
Right,
the actual indoor use.
I'm just thinking about what you said and where it fits into the regulations.
I like it.
Yeah, that's a good point, and that falls into do we want to be a little more detailed in what we mean by that, for consistency's sake, too.
And there is no, I believe, Rory, you mentioned and I'm not sure what you're talking about, where they store all these cars, so I'm sure somewhere on River Road, there is no environmental consideration of flooding. Like, you noted a good point, we don't want to sweep 100 cars full of oil and fuel and everything into the river, but there is no consideration for environmental impacts of that outside of, you can't put treatment plants in a floodplain, you can't put, out of those regulated things, there is no floodway, here's not what you do in a floodway.
Yeah, and if
That's
you had a
maybe
flood
something to
that
address.
swept all those cars away, that wouldn't even be damage to the building, and so they could put them all right back, right?
Mhm.
Yeah, we didn't touch on storage in the floodplain tonight, just not enough time, but that is an important point of consideration.
Also, one more thing I didn't mention, but like, if Zero East High goes forward before any of this stuff happens, whatever, not on our plate right now, is there a way to get like a note or require like a notification from the landlord to a renter to say, hey, you're only 1 foot above the floodplain, like consider getting a flood rider on your rental insurance? Or require getting a flood rider?
Yeah, so that would be something in the toolkit to explore as part of the education and outreach. Is this a voluntary partnership? Is it something we can require? I don't know the answer to that yet, but certainly a worthy tool.
I have one more thing. I love your image of different scores. That's very exciting to me. If you could give us a sense of public cost of meeting those certain
Yeah,
scores.
there's a whole booklet that explains the task and the points. It's almost like a game, right?
I would hope there was a
Yeah.
reasonable path forward where we could get,
Okay.
win big points.
Okay.
For low cost.
Great.
It's a beautiful thing. Do we have anything more on this matter? Thank you all very much.
Thank you, guys.
I would like to talk about design quality.
Oh, yeah. Super useful.
Entrance corridors,
Yes.
talk about that. Do you want to offer folks an opportunity to do jumping jacks?
Need a stretch, bathroom break, scream? That's the one. Lies. Thank you.
Yes, we do.
We'll return in just a moment.
See, that's my starting assumption.
It's a good assumption.
Mr. Novato, are you caught up on Jeff's presentation? Yes?
You're all set. Good answer.
Big night, seems like it's productive.
All right. I hope so. It is so from our perspective. Good. I've heard a lot of good stuff. I have a fair idea of where to go next.
Mr. Priest will start us.
All right. All right. Good evening once again. So, as I was saying a minute ago, I'm starting from the perspective that everybody was attentive for Jeff's presentation last time, so I don't need to go into a detailed discussion of what is the entrance corridor, what is that design review process. We've been over that. So, and everyone's read the memo that you guys already received, so I'm gonna highlight, obviously, this is for entrance corridors, what are we looking at? We're in some respects balancing the, whatever additional cost comes with a design review process, and just acknowledge that there is an additional cost, whatever that might be, and however great or small people may feel that is, I think it does exist. And then recognizing that in our comprehensive plan, while we are looking to accommodate additional density and new housing units throughout the city, we are also saying, I'm gonna quote from the memo from the comprehensive plan, working to celebrate the unique cultural and historical identity of the city. And the entrance corridor review process is one of those places where we have, as a tool that we can potentially use towards that goal. Now, in our approach document, we did talk about the possibility of rolling entrance corridor standards into the underlying zoning in some fashion, but we heard some concern about that idea when we last spoke about this at the beginning of August, about that there's more nuance and value in the design review discussion that would be lost in that scenario. So where we are right now is I've got a list in your memo of 8 different items that are both a combination of specific recommendations and things for you guys to discuss and consider, and I'm just gonna walk through these. So number 1 was the existing entrance corridor design review exempts single-family homes, and my proposal at this point was to expand that to up to 4 units. I'm not married to that number. I picked that number because it represents our general residential district within the comprehensive plan on the land use map. Right, so the general residential was 3 units with 4th as a bonus for retention of the existing structure. Open to other
How many general residential parcels are there in entrance corridors?
Good question.
I'm sure you
Good
know that
question.
offhand, right?
Great question. We'll make a note of that and have that. We can track down the answer to that.
I think that makes sense. It keeps it basically keeps the same, I guess, the purpose of the existing entrance corridor does not apply to single family, I
Right.
believe, right? So it's the same.
And recognizing on, again, a very general level, that additional process cost weighs more heavily on a smaller unit project than a larger unit project, on a per unit basis. So I want to clarify on number 2, I noted remove the landscaping and lighting standards. What I mean simply was that if you look at the existing ordinance as it's written, those are pretty generic standards and the types of standards that we're likely to be including on a citywide basis anyway. I'm not suggesting that there is no design review for landscaping and lighting. There would still be, that design review would still happen. The guidelines for that would exist within the design guidelines. One of the things I'm gonna keep coming back to is that what exists in the design guidelines versus what exists in the ordinance. So landscaping and lighting, there would be a section of the design guidelines or a portion of the design guidelines to speak to that issue, and it would be part of the review. But in terms of what I'm proposing to take out of the ordinance is the specific, rather generic standards that exist there today.
Do you want me to wait or you want me to ask?
No, go ahead.
So what does that mean? I'm just worried about respecting the uniqueness of every corridor. And
I think we're moving more in the direction of respecting the
Okay.
uniqueness of every corridor, because each corridor, as we have it today, and as I expect it would exist in the future, the entrance corridor design guidelines are meant to be specified to the individual corridor, and so the landscaping and lighting would be tied to the individual corridor.
okay, cool.
Similarly, signage, I would just shift it over, any specific standards within the entrance corridor review relative to signage would shift over to the sign section of the overall zoning ordinance. The other advantage we're getting here is we're now putting it within the ordinance. We don't have to look all over the place to find sign standards, landscaping standards. They are all consolidated in one part of the ordinance. Number 4 is the submittal requirements would go into the design guideline document. That's something we're looking at doing for the overall ordinance, is that submittal requirements, if you're submitting for a special permit, you're submitting for a site plan, what you're required to submit is gonna move out of the zoning ordinance itself and into some form of guidance document or document on the staff level. Really just get, so that when we need to make a change to what needs to be submitted, we don't have to make an ordinance amendment to do so. So for example, we're getting ready to have a digital building permit, our overall permitting system is gonna go digital. We're gonna go to digital submissions. Our ordinance says you have to submit paper. Right, and it will would right now require an ordinance amendment to change that. So number 5 is, this is just a broader issue of we need to bring clarity to this review process, right? When does it occur? And how does it relate to the other review processes that we're engaged in? That's just something, frankly, that we have to do. I don't know that there's much to talk about on that, except that we have to do it. Number 6 is a big one. So this was the idea of switching the ERB role, who does the design review from the Planning Commission to the BAR. I want to clarify that I realize in writing this and getting out the door that I didn't complete this section, in that our staff's recommendation at this point is that this stay with Planning Commission, despite the wording of the first sentence. What we looked at is in general, we think both entities, BAR and Planning Commission, are actually, in many respects, have equal capacity and ability to provide this role in the ERB. What we see is that the BAR represents, we believe, generally a higher intensity of review. Projects that come to BAR tend to go through more rounds of review. And we think that the entrance corridor process shouldn't necessarily go through that same level of intensity. That the Planning Commission has tended to be more of a one and done type of review, and that would be what we would suggest for the entrance corridor. Does anyone want to comment on that? Because I
Should have heard what Carl said about my aesthetic sensibilities before the meeting.
I will continue. I will continue to recommend that the ERB go to the bar, because I think they're better. They have temperament that's better than ours to do this stuff. But I think it could go to the bar, and and Jeff could just coach those guys. That, we're going to do a one and done review of this, because your job is to appreciate the aesthetics and see if the aesthetics of this thing marry to that corridor in Charlottesville, and say yay or nay, and do that in one meeting as opposed to like all the iterations that these guys do when they're looking at something more intense.
Can they do that?
What do you think, Carl?
Yeah, I mean, I think if the guidelines are clear, that, it's gotta be a simpler review. I think we've overstepped a couple times, or started to overstep a couple times in the conservation districts, which I would compare to the entrance corridor as, supposed to be kind of like BAR light. But those also are historic related. I think it needs to be clear that the entrance corridor review is not a review for preservation. It's a review for new design. And yeah, just make sure the guidelines are clear. So it's, yeah, I think the BR can do it, but we just need to be, our scope needs to be clarified. Sorry, said that 3 times.
I got it.
Same. That was the best one. Any more on that?
I think you should stay with the planning commission. I know we talk about advocating responsibility, but I think that for the same reasons that you mentioned, we're capable of evaluating the guidelines on their merit. And it sort of speaks to this ethos I have of us as a commission being able to use the vocabulary of design as we move through the rezoning process. I don't think we're gonna be happy with the results if it goes to the BAR. And I just don't think it should. I think it'll be a longer process that will not benefit the community or the developers, and I think we've done a pretty good job so far.
Mr. Ralphie, you made mouth sounds.
I was gonna say, I think it makes sense to go to the BAR. They could, if staff's concern is that we do it faster with the one and done, that could just be because the guidelines are simpler. And if they follow those guidelines, maybe they could do that. The other thing is, we can always take it back, right? We can give it to the BAR.
Council's gotta give it to the BAR, and then they gotta take it away from the BAR.
It is a zoning amendment.
But it would definitely be a statement.
I oppose giving it to the BAR, not only because I think the BAR lost all of its legitimacy this week, but also, but actually because the composition of the BAR, I think, doesn't quite make sense for it, for this. I mean, unless you're going to change the composition of the BAR, you have things like residents and owners of property, or actually, sorry, just owners of property in architectural control districts, which have nothing to do, are different places than entrance corridors. Lay people who have no architectural knowledge or ability, and it's unclear why we put them there, except that we think property owners are more important than residents or others who should care about the aesthetic values of our community. I think Commissioner Russell brought up a very good point the other day, that I thought about it, really, I really got to me, as much as I hate to admit it. By having ECRB in our role, ERB, whatever reason, we are forced to get into that aesthetic mindset of thinking about what it means for something to look good.
In keeping.
Yeah, which I think when we give things, if we were to give this to BAR, it would be out of sight, out of mind, and we could pretend it never exists, and people will get dragged through these brutal processes at BAR where everyone, bike sheds, I don't know if that's a software term. I guess it is, maybe. Everyone, bike shedding is when you argue over the color of the bike shed rather than how to build it or actually building it. And you get bogged down in these really long discussions of minutiae. And the BAR has a strong tendency to do that. And I think that won't change if the guidelines are simpler.
I don't think this is filter, does it? Does he have a filter?
But,
I'm not going to argue with 90% of what he's saying.
but yeah, as much as I hate it, I think there is value, even to me, about, particularly for these large projects like Gallery Court, and the upcoming thing on JPA, of really thinking about what it means to have the massing and height that we've set, and how to make that fit in. And I do think it's possible for that to happen. And I think it's important that we, deal with the consequences of our actions, even if it means I have to agonize over the aesthetics of things.
Mr. Grazier.
To follow on with Commissioner Stolzenberg, I mean, his comments about getting down deep into the weeds, et cetera, and the minutia and the tendency, I think that this is a clear example of only Nixon could go to China, right? But I think that lends, But more so, I think I'm generally in line with Commissioner Russell and Stoltenberg that it stays here for the reasons that they've stated. I'm also think that the culture of the institution of the BAR in terms of its intensity, I think it is highly unlikely that you're going to see the abrupt cultural change that would need to happen that would not lead to a whole bunch of frustration for people making application to it. The expectation is that you go to the meeting, and by the end of the meeting, this has been sorted out, you go walking out of there. And that, I think that needs to be to continue to be the expectation on these things. Is this gonna work or isn't it? Okay, next.
Any more issues about BAR versus PC? Actually, I guess I should say something. I understand criticisms of the BAR. I understand criticisms of the PC. I'm not clear how much of the problems are the persons and how much is the structure. I think a lot of it is structure. We're very nice, they're very nice. But
Not relevant.
my sense is the structure is very broken and out of date. So I'm not, I'm less convinced today than I was yesterday that the BAR is the right solution. And maybe there's a third solution I'm not thinking of. A new board? Exciting.
Yeah.
The clear solution is just put cornices and everything. Just
There you
write
go.
what the rules are and.
That's right, the cornice,
Don't have
the
to-
Stoltenberg cornice waiver.
Need room.
We should appoint a city master architect and they do all the architecture. Or writes them a fee. Check.
I mean, we have to create the zoning, or we review the creation of the zoning code. We're gonna be looking at form, massing, and, you know, I have imagined there's gonna be some form-based stuff that's gonna sneak its way in there at some point. I mean,
Well,
we
keep talking
deal
about
with aesthetics.
How are, how is new development, denser development in existing
Mhm.
residential going to, the neighborhood character, the form, massing, the scale, like all these things.
Yeah, but we should be
Let's-
qualified to review entrance corridor stuff.
These are gonna be big things that people are going to be coming to us about and asking for us to talk the talk.
Yeah, and in fact, on that note, like, I think it's very important that form and massing and all that are part of the zoning ordinance and not these things that are like privileged to where we're just arbitrarily deciding them willy-nilly. In fact, I would probably go so far as to say that these aesthetic reviews should not be able to modify the envelope rather than the appearance. You can change the appearance of massing, but you shouldn't be able to say, oh, it's too big, I'm not going to let you add that extra story to West Second, even if council just approved it last week.
I'm with you on that one, Lauren.
The
Not
parking
going
lot
there,
on
but-
Water Street is
No, I mean.
reference. Oh, you're not
It's a
on the
mess. I don't
gallery,
know.
yeah. Well,
I'm sensitive to some level of a reasonableness standard, that we wouldn't want to, for aesthetic reasons, make a project impossible.
Okay, so another big one was this broader notion, so we have 12 designated entrance corridors. I broadly broke these down into 3 types of entrance corridors. One being kind of your big, if you will, big box automobile-oriented retail districts. Your Route 29 North, Emmett Street Barracks. One being smaller scale commercial districts like Preston or East High, where you have more individual businesses. And then the third one being kind of a residential corridor. Now, I didn't do anything scientific. I looked at the 12 corridors and I saw 3 different types. And the only reason I bring them up is that if there was an interest in considering reducing the number of entrance corridors, it might be helpful to look at it in terms of those 3 types. There are probably a number of other ways of looking at it that would be helpful as well, but those 3 types came to mind. So,
The only thought I've got about that is, do we need to consult with the county as it relates to this, as it relates to the way we manage the corridors and they?
It's, you know, so it's interesting, I did look at the county's map for entrance corridors, and it's amazingly extensive. I was surprised. It's,
Most of them were illegal until recently. You're only allowed, counties are only allowed to have entrance corridors on arterial designated roads. And a lot of them, like Avon Street, were not designated as arterials. We had to go through a whole process with the MPO to redesignate them in order to legitimize their entrance corridor process.
okay, interesting. I didn't know that part, but I mean, it was pretty, the map's pretty extensive. I mean, it includes Route 64, 250, 29, all your major roads coming in, as well as roads like Avon, Hydraulic. We don't exactly match up. We mostly match up, but we don't exactly match up. For example, Hydraulic is, Rio is one, I believe, for them. But we don't have the entrance corridor designation picked up for John Warner. Am I getting that right?
Can't build anything on John Horner.
Well,
It's a
exactly. I
park.
know you can't. I know you can't. Well, until it becomes McIntyre.
Right, true. But McIntyre is in the entrance corridor.
In ours?
Yes,
Oh,
from 250 to Preston.
okay.
Mr. Drones, did you have thoughts on this one?
I see a utility in categorizing them. Your categorization seems just dandy to me, but I haven't given it 3 minutes of thought as to whether there's another blinding flash of the obvious to how to do it. I think that's right. I think, do we need to reduce the number? I mean, are these same roads doing the same thing they were X years ago?
So the entrance corridors are under the state
Yeah.
enabling legislation for them. They essentially are meant to be routes leading to historic,
historical.
areas of historical value. And broadly, I think the districts we've designated are leading to downtown Charlottesville broadly,
Yeah.
and UVA.
So, yeah, I guess my only question is have the character of leading to, I mean, has traffic and behavior changed to the extent that, that one really doesn't count anymore? I mean, does Avon really count if you can't get there from 64 and you're coming in from 20? Does it still, yeah, I mean, that sort of thing. Yeah.
Yeah. I think in some respects, the question to me also comes to kind of outcome as well. When, it was interesting, you know, Lau, you shared an email, which ones kind of broadly of those categories you might keep or get rid of. If I were looking at it, what's the level of impact we have in terms of an outcome on Route 29 North? Maybe pretty limited, as opposed to the outcome might be really significant on Preston. Now, I think you looked at it from a different perspective.
Yes.
I don't want to steal your thunder. But from my perspective, you were thinking more about what's the impact on the project.
Yes.
Right, and if they're generally gonna be smaller scale projects on Avon Street, the impact is higher on them, whereas your Route 29 can more readily absorb that cost. So that's two different ways of thinking about that issue.
Mr. Bob?
I'm looking at, in over 10 years, we had 13, if I'm reading this correctly, entrance review board.
Oh, I'm sorry, say it again?
Was it over the last 10 years, we only had 13
4, 1, and 6, yeah.
applications? So it's not like we're
Over 4 years.
over,
4 years.
okay, I'm looking at this wrong, I guess. Over 4 years, sorry.
Actually,
Wait.
no,
I thought it-
11, 15? 15 over 4 years.
Yeah, you're looking at the critical slopes, right?
yeah, you gotta read across. So
That's
it's-
the annual.
5 plus 6 is
both.
11.
So
Okay, yeah,
130
yeah,
over
yeah,
10
yeah.
years, but
Yep,
only
yep,
50.
yep.
Yeah, almost every time.
But you changed the comp plan, so you sort of.
We're
reading
gonna get
between
more
the tea
development.
leaves. I don't know how to predict.
Yeah.
the new trees.
That's a really good point, because this speaks to the other reason to look at increasing what is subject to an exemption, right? Because on Avon Street, we may have very few entrance corridor reviews today, because it's, single family is exempt and a lot of that corridor is exempt. If we don't increase that exemption, we'll see substantially more.
Which is maybe an argument for not dialing all things at once. I don't know.
I don't have an answer for you. I think, going to Commissioner Duranzio's point, if the purpose is still the same and that's why we need them, then I don't know why we'd change them. But if a road isn't serving that purpose anymore, then we can take it out.
But I don't think that's, you're just talking about combining the, like, we've got the map section, chapter 5 of our guidelines describes, I guess, 12 different types of corridors. So we're not taking them out, it's more of combining the descriptions of all of them, is that right?
No, I was actually asking the question.
Oh, actually
whether
removing
the
some
planning
of them.
commission would want to consider removing it.
I'm sorry.
And at this
Clear.
point, I'm not recommending it. But I felt it appropriate to ask the question.
Got it.
Particularly given, and Jeff raised a really good point there, particularly given that with the change in the comp plan and the exemption program, we may see an increase in the number of applications. But also thinking about where we're getting the outcomes that we're seeking under this program.
I totally misread that.
Sorry, that's my.
I just wanted to bring up something that's kind of funny, I guess. And it was brought to my attention and our attention by Jenny Keller. I'm not sure that the comp plan spells out what the entrance corridors are as we define them currently. The closest I can see is Goal 7 entrance corridor. Ensure that the quality of development in Charlottesville's designated entrance corridor, overlay district, is compatible with the city's requirements and standards, so maybe it's there, and with the adjacent neighborhood's historic, architectural, and cultural resources while allowing for reuse of the structures and evolutions of uses in those areas. That's not really about creating a corridor to go to the historic and tourism places. And maybe that is what we want it to be, but.
Well, that's what comes from the state law. When the state law says you can create entrance corridors, it's speaking to the routes. It's
So then.
kind of aimed in some respects specifically towards tourism.
Mhm.
But
But that's a little bit different than keeping them compatible with the adjacent neighborhoods, historic, architectural.
which we called for in the
cultural
comprehensive plan.
resources. Pardon?
Which we identified in the comprehensive plan.
Yeah,
And-
it's sort of like, are we going this way with them or this way with them, a little bit.
I see, right. And it is tricky because when you read that enabling legislation, it kind of blurs together and it almost seems to be implying that your design aesthetic on the entrance corridors is supposed to match that of your destination. And I don't think that's what anybody does with entrance corridors, because otherwise all of Route 29 might look like UVA, and that's ridiculous.
And I think that's more to what the comprehensive plan is
I think we're
getting at and
yeah.
what we want, so I
Right.
think that's good and that clarifies that. I don't have any other, my big thing was I feel really strongly it should stay with the planning commission.
Mr. Schwartz?
I completely misunderstood the question. I don't think we should be, getting rid of any of these. I mean, if we can make it, and I think you had it in here somewhere where, I mean, Jeff is already doing a lot of admin review, so it's not even coming to us. If we can make that even more streamlined, so there's even more admin review, I think that helps. But no, I mean, it's about quality development where it matters in the city. So yeah, I don't think we should be removing any of that.
Mr. Stolzenberg?
I think, well, back to our earlier conversation, also the John Warner didn't exist when these things were designated.
didn't
The John
exist?
Warner did not exist
True.
when these existed. And so, in terms of streets that have like changed, the big one probably would be Park Street, right? Which is what Ryo goes into and
Yeah.
used to be the big entrance corridor, but was already in an ADC.
Mhm.
And so it wasn't an entrance corridor, so we can't remove it. But in terms of ones that I think are weird, Avon south of Monticello is less of a main thoroughfare into town. It does exit the city, but it's, you know, primarily residential. I don't know if it totally makes sense to have it. You're right, it's medium now, but other corridors that aren't entrance corridors are medium too. And so it doesn't seem strictly necessary to keep them, you know, different from those. Also, I think our only general residential entrance corridor parcels are the lots on Avon and Early Street, which we removed from medium because they complained.
Nothing on Monticello?
No, I think all of Monticello is medium. Also, Preston.
It's true. Yeah, many of the entrance corridors are medium, just basically because of how that construction of that map. But we don't assume that every single project in there is going to get
Yeah, that's
up
true. You
to
could still
8,
have 4 unit
12.
things.
Four is still an option.
Yeah. I mean, to me, it almost makes some sense to say it should be based on footprint, or maybe even, you know, area of the wall facing the entrance corridor. So, I mean, if you have a 4-plex with a bunch of 4-bedroom units versus a 12-plex with 1 bedrooms, those aren't, like, necessarily different on the outside. And it doesn't totally make sense to me to designate one and not the other.
That's fair.
I've always found it strange that Barracks is not an entrance corridor, but Preston is.
Yeah.
So you suddenly magically, if you're entering the city, you magically appear at Washington Park,
Yeah.
and then you're in an entrance corridor. It doesn't make any sense.
Entry from where? Yeah.
I mean, not that I don't. It probably doesn't matter. I'm not saying you should necessarily need to add Barracks. I think the other 2 parts of entrance corridors that are maybe different from the others are 29 and Fish Street south of Harris. And I think it's not that we want to remove aesthetic review for those, because as Commissioner Russell often says, we like having the big box stores have to adapt to our architectural style. But I think maybe we can consider expanding the administrative scope for those. So, because Jeff kind of tells us what they should be anyway, and we kind of go with what he says. And I say make the target a giant rotunda, but nobody agrees with me. That's all I got.
I had a couple of thoughts on this one. One was, yes, thinking about cost and areas where this is going to create the most cost burden, and consider either carving those out, reducing the level of burden upon them, make them more administrative, to manage that cost and that burden. And in areas where, you know, the cost can be borne, worry about that less. The other one was an idea about area. That some places have a greater aesthetic impact. A little, you know, 2-bay, you know, 2-story does not change the character of, you know, of an entire, you know, corridor. But a gigantic, you know, 6-story thing that covers an entire block, significant aesthetic impact. That I buy. That I definitely buy. So I think that kind of sort of measurable way of scoping the whether or not something gets regulation and to what degree of regulation I think could be helpful. I was concerned about the 4 number versus, because we're doing sort of a missing middle intensity initiative with the comp plan, and I was concerned that 4 leaves the missing middle out. That falls under these regs, and they're in sort of a place, especially if they're doing affordable housing bonuses, where that could be a significant burden. So my thought would be that we would consider changing that from 4 to a 12. That's what I've got on that.
If I could just throw it in there, I mean, you can, I said this last time when we talked, you can build cheap, you can build cheaply. You can, you know, per building code, you know, there, you can do the least and vinyl siding that'll blow off in 3 years. So those are the sort of things where in an entrance corridor, we might be saying, what are the materials that are being used? Prefer a cement board, no vinyl siding, windows that last longer than 5 years. So you know, there's not necessarily saying an EC review guarantees quality, but I think I just, having been in the construction business a long time, be careful with saying, you know, oh, we just let them build the least they could do per code, we're gonna get quality housing. You may get housing, you may get numbers, but you may get something that is falling apart in 2 years. So, I don't know, there's a tension there that you all should deal with. But you also may get, you know, you may say, well, we're not talking about an entire block, but it might be 6 projects all in a row. So now that block becomes what, everything you've exempted. And I'm just trying to offer some of the what ifs. I mean, ideally, in a really interesting world, I would say, there's a lot we can do at staff, and if you want to appeal it up, you can, although that's, I'm not sure how we want to go with that, but I mean, that is one way to do it. But, sorry, just putting in my 2 cents about material. One of the things that I push for the most in the entrance corridors are what are the materials being used, and permanence of materials, similarity materials, you know, metal, stone, concrete, brick, wood, and not, you know, vinyl and plastic, and so we're, you know, able to control that a little bit.
Ms. Creasy will remember back in my first iteration on the planning commission, one of the chairs was John Fink.
The John Fink.
And John Fink, he loved the entrance corridor reviews, but he would always demand that they use what he called noble materials. You weren't going to be able to do anything that was not going to be lasting. So
Something
his
Vitruvius
word
would
was
respect
noble
that.
materials.
Good word.
The entrance corridor should be characterized by noble materials throughout.
I kind of like the idea you just mentioned of staff reviews, and if someone disagrees, they appeal to the planning commission. I don't know how messy that is, but that seemed kind of nice.
Across the board? Across the board?
That was actually Jody's recommendation when he was leaving, about when he and I were arguing about this. Okay, fine, keep it with the planning commission, but then it goes to you, and in fact, it could be a part of the consent agenda. We have the ability to pull it out of the consent agenda if we feel there's something in there that's out of whack.
That's intriguing.
Aye.
So, I mean, that was Jody's recommendation, and he also loved the review, but he also respected your guidance.
Well, that's where we sort of talked, yeah, it's like, who's the, is it a function of who's in that office? Or is it, I mean, I'm not a designer, but I
Jeff's
appreciate.
not gonna retire, it's fine.
It's not allowed, Jeff.
I would
Well,
just
if
ask.
it starts slipping, it gets pulled from the agenda.
That becomes an indicator.
That's right. I've been slipping a lot. I think the question, if I could add to go back to, and I circled it in James's notes, because he says it a couple times, how the ERB is to conduct its review process. And I know maybe it's not to be thoroughly discussed tonight, but I just want to be clear that one of the, and I will also say there's a lot of mythology about the BAR process that I don't know where it all started, but the BAR is not the where projects go to die that people seem to think, and we don't argue about colors like people think. But is that when a project of a large scale is coming to you all, it costs an architect a lot of money. Well, to pay an architect to develop a set of drawings, right, Kareem? Because you guys just go right to construction drawings every time. You know, I mean, you have to build a design through that process, and to tell someone, go finish your design and bring it to me one night. And and by the way, we may get to it around 10:45 if we're lucky on the agenda. That's a really heavy lift. That's an expense. I'm not saying that you all have to be like the BAR, and I think the result the other evening, 1301 Bertland, really
Yes.
was and the architects have been really good to work with us on those type of projects where we're kind of, all right, where are we? And we developed something, evolved into something I think it is really good.
If that one gets built, you guys will think that's a success.
Yeah, But I don't know, and that's smaller, significantly smaller than what you're gonna be looking at JPA in a couple of weeks. And so I'm trying to, balance where if someone really wants to get feedback as they go, that's the question. I'm not saying we can't do it or has to be necessarily codified, but I just wanna make sure that there's an understanding that there are going to be projects that come in, particularly with this comp plan, that I think deserve at least at least one discussion prior to ask an architect to spend.
Yeah, so, yeah, I disagree with the notion that the reason not to give it to the BAR is that we have to do everything in one day. I think having preliminary discussions, probably even on work session days where it's not the last thing on our agenda after 5 public hearings, is a good idea for large projects. I don't want to spend 4 meetings hashing out the Chick-fil-A and like whether their lights should be dimmable.
Don't either.
But like that JPA thing, I think it's very reasonable to come and ask us for input. That said, like they are architects and they're paid by them, and I expect them to come up with some decent architecture without us doing it for them. And I feel like the architecture by committee often leads to bad results, which is why the ECRB has not had major failures, but the BAR has.
Yes and no, and it really, I will say, all of us probably suffered from COVID more than we realize, and that we don't even know each other enough to come together and have conversations. So there's some relationship building that has to happen, that has nothing to do with what's in these, and I will take care of that. But it is, just that applicants will ask me, what should I do? And I just don't know what to tell them about you all. And what's interesting is, at times they'll say, well, can you review it? And I'll say, well, if I do it, this is what I want. So there's been this interesting dynamic where people are very willing to work with, like that KFC. That's not gonna happen every time. I certainly don't wanna be the guy in charge of approving 2005 JPA.
That concern that you're highlighting, whether it's 2005
Right.
JPA or Chick-fil-A, how much of it is driven by the potential inadequacy of this document?
Some of it in there to me is just fluffy, it's like, some of it's comp plan language, strive for, what is that, our goal is, we're, and it's not yes, no in the guidelines for the BAR, but there is a level of precision. There's pick colors that are, vibrant and complementary. I suck at colors. Although red, you all know I don't like red. But there could be things in there, and it might just have to be by examples. I don't know. Maybe, like I said, we have to go away one weekend and work through some prior EARB projects and just say, gee, how would we have handled this? I don't know.
How much of it is because national student housing developers in particular are building big boxy 5/1s everywhere, getting yelled at by design review, adding a bunch of modulation that they're asking for, and they just expect that back and forth and getting yelled at, and so they're just trying to skip that process instead of trying to architect a good thing from the beginning?
Yes, no. I think that, before, when you all were discussing, I just made some notes. I said, what have been the successes of the entrance corridors? And I would say, big one's been franchise design. We really do, people come and they want to work with us, and same with the county. It's not this is our standard store. To some extent, yes, but they're also malleable and listen. And their lighting has been a big one, but that's one we can address with some of the standards. Signage, primarily colors and lighting, has been, we have a lot of success with that, but again, probably something could be addressed with regs. Landscaping and screening of things. We've accomplished things, but again, probably could take care of that with some ordinance and regulations.
Though, I'm just saying, the recommendation here is that there would be design guidelines associated with that, and
Right.
the only change what I'm suggesting here with the ordinance is to actually pull that stuff out of the entrance corridor and regulations out of the ordinance and just put it in the
I
guidelines.
got you.
Yeah.
One of the questions we had was, because the entrance corridors and historic districts are now in the whole land use section. And I remember in the early discussions, I said, well, we only have purview, we don't have purview over the entire city. So if there are things that, you know, that really work with lighting, with landscaping, with signage, then apply that to the whole city.
Sure.
And then you can get those things taken care of. They aren't
Right.
just occurring in an entrance corridor. So that's a big one to figure out.
Yeah.
But I think that the key success of this review is those basic elements, like you were saying, the materials, the colors, the shapes. Somebody came in a couple weeks ago with one big, round, false pediment. You know, I said, no, we don't have those. That's not what this area looks like. So we were able to have that conversation with them. But I think I said, and I wrote, you know, the weaknesses is how we review large projects, things that don't need to be reviewed. I think there's a lot we could look at with, I've approved things that have come in as building permit request, or as a site plan, somebody's got a fence, yeah, it's a site plan, I think we're looking at that. And, and I think there are some places where the entrance corridor maybe not necessarily eliminated, maybe it gets narrowed, or maybe that scope, like on 29, to be looking way down the hill to, you know, behind Seminole Square, might just simply be, I mean, that's a stretch. So I think some clarification.
What your point is the current ordinance that defines incorporation into the entrance corridor by the full extent of the parcel touching the street, as opposed to perhaps a defined distance from the street.
So, I don't know, so those are my thoughts, for what they're worth.
Responses to that?
One thing I hear a lot from architects in aesthetic review stuff is that they want to give the project architects the ability to do creative things, and that's why they don't want to have really prescriptive guidelines. Is it worth it? Does we ever get anything good from that, or do they do something crazy and we say no and they go to some bland compromise or to what we could have asked for in the first place? Would it be easier for everyone
So have
if we said red brick and cornices?
Oh, God, no, please don't. I think that we suffer as a community from, I mean, we've got a lot of good architects here who do a lot of good work around the world. And, you know, anybody that's been to London, or heck, I was in Richmond this past weekend, and you just see innovative new things happening, and we really don't have enough of it here, really, to sort of say we see it. But no, I don't get in the entrance corridors, people saying, I want to push the envelope of new design. It really is, it's a shorter term use that a lot of them are looking at. I mean, Wawa's not building down there to be there for the next 50 years. I mean, they'd like to be, but that's not what they were building.
I'm interested in Carl and Kareem's response to that same question as architects. Sorry to put you guys on the spot. And there was something else in what you said that I thought was interesting. Oh, whether the idea that we're not getting that really interesting architecture is a product of the entrance corridor or a product of just our market.
Yeah, I mean, spec development, you're gonna,
Right.
yeah. I will say, I mean, with the BAR, I think we do get watered down design because people are afraid. And then they come in and are like, well, you could have done this, this, and this, and it could have been really cool. And they're like, oh, but that doesn't look Jeffersonian. Like, well, that's the point. So I think there's some fear from the BAR. I don't know if that exists with the ERB, but I imagine that what you said, it's, big box store doesn't really care. They're not gonna put an expensive design on it, but
Yeah, I mean, I haven't done any entrance review projects, but I've done a bunch of BAR and or I've worked on them. I don't think it has really hampered that way. It's when I'm sitting there and I'm seeing a lot of other applications, a lot of them are either ABAR or ARB in the county. You know, you get the chains that they have to conform to our local materials, or I see it as a way to kind of stop the, some developers that want to just use the cheapest thing to get some franchise or something out there, and make them use bricks or something better. We do get some projects, like we've worked on some projects where we went through a couple of iterations, but it was like minor stuff with the BAR from my recent memory. But I don't think it does drive the project, initially when you're looking at the design now that I'm thinking about it, but it's what the purpose of it is, right? You're trying to conform to the general context of the area, and you can get creative that way if you stay within those guidelines. That's what kind of what we said we want by having a BAR and an entrance review.
I will say, I think the architecture that's popped up just south of the downtown district is a little more interesting than what we've been seeing in the district. I don't know what that's all about. Now that we're picking on the BAR, I think we should be picking on the ERB.
That's gonna be like the Sharks and the Jets coming up after.
I will say
You've
that I
nailed
feel
it on
like
every one.
sometimes, not to completely agree with Rory or anything, it does feel arbitrary when you're presenting to the BAR, because it just, I think a lot of people then try to, or I've seen it happen to other projects where they design for them instead of kind of just following the guidelines.
I will say you all don't review solar panels because they only require electrical permit, so they don't come to you. But we can talk about, and I can fully explain to you what happened.
Well, we're not gonna do that on later.
We are not. An issue that I have, and really with the enabling legislation, but I think that's filtered down into our current guidelines, is how car-brained our current guidelines are. They literally specify, I am in a car, I am driving, I'm facing this direction, this is my experience as a driver. And I'm reading the comp plan, we're not trying to get people in cars. We're trying to get people, we're looking for change. Can we do that?
That might be why these aren't very detailed design guidelines. You're going so
Can't see
fast,
very
you can't
well.
see the details.
I mean, well, I will say, and even going back to Mary Joy's reviews, the thing that jumps out most often is that sort of activating the street, that pedestrian experience. So it's very much part of the guidelines. The enabling legislation was written in terms of someone in their car coming to your community and, having the ability to control the aesthetics of it. But I do agree with you. There are parts of there are entrance corridors which are, and even they say it in there, this is Fifth Street South. This is a auto-oriented. This is aimed at the folks coming on and off of 64. There's an acknowledgement of that. And I think that there is a piece of the comp plan would be, there's also an economic development and a fiscal, benefit reality to those things. There are those things that serve that larger community, and we realize that and address that, particularly in Fifth Street, and I think we'll talk more. So I don't think there's anything that says in these guidelines we're not supportive of sidewalks and pedestrians. But a lot of that happens in the public right of way. Where are those trees? Where are those sidewalks? Where those crossing points? That's within the city's right of way, and that's where I think we forget. We have the ability to control and build those.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point in terms of like putting these entrance corridors into buckets. Like the ones that it seems like we've had the most activity during your tenure have been the really car-oriented ones. I think what we're sort of trying to think about is like, how are these going to work in this new world where it's not like where people actually want to build things on the other entrance corridors, that like residential buildings, like small residential buildings. And I think for the most part, I think it's worked pretty well for the car-oriented places. I think a little bit it's, putting a lipstick on a pig because those places are terrible. And Route 29 will still continue to be terrible, but at least it's like a little bit less aesthetically terrible. But it's all very different on JPA, on Preston, on, the north, really all of Avon, and Monticello, but we haven't had anything in any of those, except Dairy Market, I guess.
So, one way to think about it too is like Barracks Road Shopping Center. You know, fascinating place from so many levels. It's, you know, one of the oldest sort of retail developments in the country. It's extremely successful. Its opening is why we ended up with a downtown mall, because there was moving there. But when someone comes in for an individual storefront, there's really not a whole lot to look at. I'm not compelling them to redevelop their mall. Now, they may get to that point, and maybe we want to get that, but the entrance corridor review of the Chick-fil-A that went in there is not going to result in that becoming a multi-story place. So just so understand, you're going to see a project in a couple of weeks that really is, it's a big empty big box that they need to dress up a little bit. They're not rebuilding it, so they're, you know, how much I can say, oh, we want this to become this pedestrian-friendly downtown, you know, it's not there.
The entrance corridor is not gonna be the vehicle for
Right,
that.
right.
But the,
Right.
I mean, Roy, you wanna restate your question
Yeah.
I guess it's not so much a question as like,
or comment?
it's what we really should be worrying about here is like, for the most part, entrance corridors have worked pretty much fine because they've been really only 29 and Fish Street have had stuff happen on them. My worry is that entrance corridors will significantly inhibit the goals of the comprehensive plan on all of those other entrance corridors that are not the supercar-centric places, by adding like an onerous level of review to even small projects. That's where I think having an exemption based on footprint matters, or I guess you could say up to 12, or I don't know.
There's a number of different ways. We'll explore the different ways of measuring where that exemption falls, whether it's units or size or anything like that, because really good points raised on that topic. But-
Or somehow making the process so much easier that it's not onerous.
And that could be, right now, we basically have exemption or review, but in practice, we have exemption, administrative review, and full review.
Mhm.
And we could build that out in the ordinance as well.
Yeah, and I guess what I'm saying is there's just not enough precedent,
Yeah.
you could say, to use an architectural term, to know what the problems with the entrance corridor are outside of those big box store places, and
Well, and
gas
as we
station places.
as we actually propose ordinance language, and we get into details and start actually putting solutions or answers to these questions on paper, we will start to hear from the folks who do have that perspective, I would expect,
Yeah.
so.
Do our guidelines for the entrance corridor, I apologize, because I obviously didn't read them all. I know, well, I've got them here too. Do they try to reduce massing from what the overall allowed envelope is? Or is it just the skin of the building?
Skin and building appearance, it's
Okay.
the articulated facades and things like that.
So that takes away some concern.
That said, I'll be honest, it's a part of the entrance corridor review that I'm not entirely clear on, but we have kind of a two-step process where you guys are advising at the point of a special permit or a rezoning, which is, to go back to the earlier conversation about kind of threshold questions versus detailed design questions, it's a threshold question. And then, so 2005 JPA is the last example of this. You guys, as the ERB, made a recommendation, I guess, to yourselves and the city council relative to that special use permit, and then it's coming back to you at the deeper end of that design process. And that's one of the big areas that I think we need to kind of sort out and make some decisions on is the entrance corridor review strictly the later end, and in which case, can we eliminate that portion of the process? Or is there something we need to sort out in this first part? So,
Not to ourselves, to the PC, it's completely different.
yes, yeah, I understand, yeah.
So, I mean, that raises the question of like, is there, I think really we decided between, is there no detrimental impact, or there's detrimental impact, but it could be mitigated with ECRB review.
Yes.
Is there really a scenario where you say there is a detrimental impact, it can't be mitigated, but then the SUP gets approved, we approve the SUP anyway?
Well, you don't, you're just.
True, so if we were to say it couldn't be mitigated, and that's an ECRB thing, does that have to be appealed to council before the SUP proceeds?
No, because it's not a COA.
Just a
COAs are
recommendation.
appealable, or a denial or approval COA, but like a deferral is not appealable, or your recommendation on a comp signage plan, because they're going to council.
But even inherent in that detrimental can't be mitigated recommendation, that's essentially the ERB making a statement around questions of massing and height that are otherwise allowed under zoning.
Except that it's an SUP, so it wasn't allowed under zoning. I mean, I guess if it's an SUP for
Fair
density
enough.
only, we would still make that determination,
I'll tell you,
potentially.
I don't know. I really, and I try to give some thought, like what, I mean, for example, the things you've reviewed have been drive-throughs, a lot of drive-throughs, additional height, and new setbacks. I don't know, I guess you would say if someone wanted to put a drive-through on the mall, that's the BAR, but I don't know, but I really can't think of where, the challenge came with you all was we had within the guidelines, for example, on JPA, the recommendation for the corridor was not up to date with what was in the comp plan. So if,
This
so if
recommendation.
it's, if the request is not in line with the comprehensive plan and, the entrance corridor recommendations being part of that, you could answer that. But I'll be honest, that's just such a tricky one because we had sort of competing, guidance. But, I mean, I don't know. I'd have to probably have maybe a charrette or something, say, all right, let's think of things that are non-mitigatable. How bad could it get? But I can't, I think that if it stays within the envelope allowed by zoning, then the guidelines give you the tools to have a design you like. You're not mitigating something, you're approving a design which meets the guidelines.
And if we're not messing with the zoning envelope, I think we're
Yeah.
really not, the risk for the architect's pro forma or the developer's pro forma is a lot less. Like, if we have the ability to say, well, you gotta chop a big chunk out of this building to split it in two or something, or take a floor off of it, I think that's very different from saying, well, the exterior material can't be vinyl siding. I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think if we explicitly say that you can't do that, that we can't do that, I think that's good. It's not totally clear to me that we cannot, because the BAR does it all the time, or at least.
Well, no, we do, and that's part of our purview is to, like our guidelines say, within 200% of the size of adjacent buildings and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, we've
that's a
never-
different animal.
The BAR's never denied a height or, typically the setbacks have been consistent with zoning. I mean,
They denied the height on West Second.
No, they
did
denied the
not.
articulation at the base of West Second.
that was a long, that one, that's another one I'll fill you in on, but the.
I can fill you in on that one
Yeah,
because I
yeah,
was
that-
there.
That was not one. But I don't know of any buildings that the BAR has said, you cannot build to the zoning envelope. I'm not, I mean, they may be out there, but I'm not aware of any. And I'll be honest with you, in a BAR meeting, I would probably say to the BAR is, they're allowed to build up to a 3.5-story building here, just like we dealt with over here on Third Street. So, I try to remind the BAR that. But the point that James was making is that when you all in an SUP say this can be up to 10 stories, and they come in at 10 stories, you've established that that's where you can't say, oh, well, we'd like you to go at 9. You set that bar.
JPA is gonna be a lot of fun.
JPA is going to be an interesting place for the next 10 years.
Oh, I mean, the ECRB, that's gonna be a lot of fun. That's coming soon, isn't it?
Soon being a relative term, yes.
Okay.
we have anything more on ECRP before we close?
One question,
Please.
going back to the landscape portion in the beginning. I know there was a concern by the tree commission on taking out, or implications to street trees. I just want to,
Roll them into this.
okay,
Right?
they'll
So if
be
we- if we
there.
have- If we want street tree standards, now, this governs what happens on private property, but if there are tree standards that we would want to have that are associated with different corridors, you put them in this. So,
An interesting question about trees. Like, we work hard to protect those magnolias on Emmett Street, and that's where I've, round and round behind the scenes that you guys don't see. But I don't know about you all, but I can't stand a tree that's got like, the power lines, got like a hole cut so
Oh,
you can
yeah.
go through it. And so it's like, well, why are we planting trees that, ultimately they've got to cut up?
If you ever go to walk there in the summer, you'd appreciate
Well,
that
and,
tree.
and that's where someone from the tree commission said, well, imagine it from the perspective of, you're not in your Google car, you're walking on that sidewalk, and it was, I went, huh. So, I don't know, there's always, ways to change, but you're right, there are the things we can control within the public, right of way, and that should be, our design guidelines, our design standards manual can address a lot of those. From the property in, we can address things with
so
our
as a general
C
rule,
guidelines.
so I want to more fully answer your question, Kareem, and then I'll close the meeting. As a general rule, if there's something that we're looking at to be a standard that we want to see everywhere, we're going to try and put that in the zoning ordinance and say this is required everywhere. And to that end, we are exploring with our legal advisor, what are we allowed under state enabling legislation to do with regard to trees? So that's one of the questions we've provided to our legal advisor. If it's specific, if we want to say that along Avon Street, that the tree species that must appear in your front yard are, magnolia and sequoia.
Good luck.
Yeah.
I like that choice too.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
shows up in here. Got it? And we, as we've noted, we need to rewrite this, reflective of the new comprehensive plan and all of that, so.
Rich McIntyre, 2 parcels, basic logic says they should probably be in there too. I don't know whether or not. Just ends it.
It's interesting that it ends there, right?
Yeah.
As soon as that. It's just a gap
That's
in that space.
Yeah.
Interestingly, so
Staples and
just note
McDonald's.
for the table, Rory has proposed adding 2 sections.
The comp plan says consider adding corridors.
There you go.
I'm just following the comp plan.
There you go, appreciate it.
Yeah, Cherry Avenue had been in there for a while, and I honestly, I don't need more work, but if you all want to add stuff, I'm not going to stand in the way.
I just want to know if we're protecting the Bradford pears on Preston.
Oh,
That's core
those
to the
are
character, right?
endangered species.
Yeah, if you wanted to add.
We gotta do something.
I do think that we should not add additional corridors, but if we do, I think we should consider rail transit, and I think we should just consider a bike path.
Rail transit, interesting.
It is a thing. Final considerations before we wrap?
Put my street on ERP, no.
I would entertain a motion.
Motion to adjourn.
Sure.
Oh, no, I'm not going to let him do it.
No, you're not? All right.
Second. Wait a second.
I had
get thumbs?
I had a good one.
I'll use it next time.
Nah.
I won't be here.
Thumbs to vote out? I see thumbs. Good night, all. Thank you very much.
Only for today. It will not occur for another year.
Rory,